Spiderman, a novelization by Peter David. Based on the original screenplay by David Koepp. Based on the Marvel comic book by Stan Lee. This audiobook is dedicated to the author of this story, as well as the author of many other stories, both in the Marvel Universe and worlds beyond, Peter David. Prologue. Let's wake the dead, baby! The souped-up black Corvette roared down the main road of the cemetery, gravel blasting out from under its tires, spraying every which way. A few squirrels, foraging for food, frantically scrambled for the nearest trees as the car, its double headlights flaring, cut hard to the right. Its rear fishtailed around, and the wheels spun on dirt and grass for a moment before once again finding purchase on the narrow pathway. The road was intended for slow, stately processions. A hearse, followed by limos or regular cars bearing grieving and stricken friends and family. It wasn't designed for hot rods and fast turns. But the drivers and passengers of the midnight vet couldn't have cared less. They were too busy laughing at the top of their lungs, blaring the horn and gunning the engine so enthusiastically that it seemed as if they would fulfill their stated purpose and cause the deceased to rise up in protest. Their names were Tyler, Keith, and Daniel, and they were flying high. They'd just come from a ball game over at the stadium in Flushing. It had been an extra innings nail-biter that the home team had managed to pull out of the fire at the last moment, and the boys were pretty liquored up. So they were feeling good about baseball in general and themselves in particular. The vet had a small ding in the rear bumper, but otherwise was in perfect working order. Tyler, at the wheel, had decided he wanted to open her up, and one of the best places to do that was the main drag outside the local cemetery, since it wasn't particularly well-traveled at night. As they had driven past, however, they'd noticed that only a single padlock hanging on a heavy chain was keeping the large wrought iron gate closed. A quick clipping with a pair of cutters that Tyler kept stashed in the trunk, and moments later they had the moonlit cemetery all to themselves. The guys looked fairly alike. They all had their heads shaved down to a razor cut, and they had similarly large and sloped brows that indicated considerably advanced cranial capacity, if one happened to be a Cro-Magnon. Keith was wearing sunglasses, ignoring the fact that it was pitch black out. They were, however, easily distinguishable one from the other. Through their facial markings, Keith's face was smeared with solid blue makeup, while Tyler was wearing orange. These coincided with the official colors of their favorite baseball team, and they had festooned their faces as a mark of solidarity. Daniel had simply shaved all his hair off, down to the roots. Tyler screeched toward an intersection, hesitated only a moment, then cut hard left. The roar of the engine filled the cemetery, barely drowning out the joyful howling of the guys in the car. Hard left again, and then right, tearing all over the place like the ghost of a driver killed in a high-speed crash. Shooting off the road, the vet hurtled across a row of graves. Daniel suddenly encountered a slight decline of nerves, and from the minimal back seat into which he was crunched, he pounded on Tyler's shoulder. "Knock it off, man. This ain't funny." "They're dead, man. What do they care?" Tyler shot back. "Yeah, man, let the man drive," said Keith, who was riding shotgun but had twisted around to face Daniel. Suddenly, the vet slammed into a halt. It didn't happen with a screech of tires or an abrupt shuddering of metal. It had just stopped, as if it had hit a brick wall, except somehow the front wasn't caved in. "Tyler, you can't drive worth spit," howled Keith. "I didn't do it," Tyler shouted in protest. "You're driving, man." "I didn't do it," he repeated. "Something's holding us. Look." He slammed his foot onto the gas pedal, and the engine roared. The car drifted from one side to the other, the tires chewing up dirt, but otherwise, it didn't move. The full moon, which had been illuminating the graveyard, now drifted behind a bank of clouds, and the night air seemed even more chill. I'm getting out to see what's going on. Tyler unlocked the door and pushed against it. Then he pushed again. The door won't open. Keith tried to shove open the door on his side and had no more luck. Okay, man, this is screwed up. Suddenly, Daniel pointed with trembling finger. What's that? What the hell is that? Some sort of strange grayish strands were covering the side windows and the windshield. They were blind and trapped. There's something out there, shouted Daniel. Oh, really? You think? Keith, the oldest, tried to sound sarcastic, but it only came out scared. Daniel's mind was racing. It's a monster. Some kind of alien bug creature. It's wrapping us in a cocoon to eat us later. Tyler twisted around to stare at his friend. What are you, stupid? But the truth was that he'd been thinking the exact same thing. He'd just been too panicked and felt like too much of a jerk to say anything. That was when the car started to shake violently. The guy screamed, cried out, shouted for someone, anyone to help them, as the car rocked from one side to the other. Tyler let out a scream that they could have heard on the other side of the white stone bridge, even as he shoved the car back into drive. And then, with a rending of metal, they were free, the rear bumper having been torn clean off. The main gate still hung open, and they barreled through it at top speed, honking the horn like mad, which was fortunate since it was the only thing that kept them from smearing themselves along the side of an oncoming truck transporting, appropriately enough, beer. The truck slammed to a halt as the vet darted around it. Before long, the smell of burning rubber and the frightened cries of the trespassers faded from the night air. In the cemetery, all was still. Then, a figure clad in blue and red emerged from the branches of one of the large oak trees, so dark that it seemed as if one of the shadows had separated and come to life. He moved so silently that the absence of sound would have prompted any onlooker to think that maybe he wasn't there at all. His body was muscular, but at the same time extremely well proportioned, and he moved with a lithe, skittering grace that seemed barely human. His gloves and boots were dark red, as was the design that spread up his chest and down his arms. His mask was the same color, but was interrupted by two eyepieces that were impenetrable from the outside. Indeed, anyone looking at him would have wondered how in the world he was able to see at all. Thin black web patterns covered all the scarlet areas of the costume, and on his chest, just over his solar plexus, there was the design of a spider with its legs outstretched. Had he simply been standing up, walking along down a main thoroughfare in the middle of the day, arms swinging casually at his sides, he might have looked like a circus refugee. But here, in the still of the night, with only the eyepieces visible as the moon once again darted behind the shadows, he looked more like a spider himself in human form, spit out by dark forces which ordinary mortals could never even begin to comprehend, except in their deepest nightmares. He dropped to the ground, still noiseless, and surveyed the area which had, so short a time ago, been the scene of unbridled pandemonium. Looking at the tire tracks that scarred the earth, he shook his head and mentally scolded himself for not having arrived sooner and therefore having done more. But then, that's always the way, isn't it? He said softly. As much as he might berate himself for not having arrived sooner, at least he had arrived just in time. The path of the racing vet would have taken it directly across the one grave site in the cemetery that was important to him. His intervention had prevented that, bringing the speeding car up short. And hopefully the lame brains who'd been in the thing would never, ever so much as think about setting foot in that place again. Still so silent, Silent as a ghost, silent as the grave, the masked man walked over to the headstone that was his destination, then crouched in front of it. "Hey," he said softly in greeting. "Did you see them run? Pretty good show, huh?" He reached gingerly toward the headstone and ran his fingers over the letters. "At least you got a good view. That's what the guy at the funeral home promised, that you'd have a good view. Paid extra for it, but it was worth it." He paused there for a moment longer, as if uncertain what to say, or even why he had come by in the first place. "I'm sorry," he said finally. I should have come by and spoken with you sooner. I know I haven't been by for a while, but I wasn't sure what to say, how to start the conversation, you know. But here, check this out. I figured this would be an icebreaker." He stood and turned in place, his arms outstretched to either side, like a runway model. "Like the outfit? I figured to make the best and worst dressed list of all at the same time. And the pecs, not bad, huh?" And he flexed to prove his point. "I mean, okay, I'm no Arnold or even Kevin Sorbo, but I've come a long way, right? Not the way you figured I'd end up, right? I guess..." The jocularity seemed to fade. "I guess neither of us ended up the way we thought we would, huh?" Then the masked man took a step back and placed one hand on his chest as if in surprise. "Who am I, you ask?" he said in mock astonishment, as if a voice had addressed him from the grave. Then he leaned forward and continued in a surprisingly conversational tone. "You sure you want to know? The story of my life is not for the faint of heart. If somebody said it was a happy little tale, if somebody told you I was just your average, ordinary guy, not a care in the world..." Then his voice choked for a moment, and he forced himself onward. "Somebody lied." Struggling to pull himself together again, to recapture the carefree air of joie de vivre that typified his costume persona, he flipped over so that he was doing a handstand with his left hand only. Mine, he called out, like a ringmaster encouraging all onlookers to listen in, as if he were addressing all the other graves within hearing, "is a tale of pain and sorrow, longing and heartache, anger and betrayal. And that just covers the high school years. But let me assure you, this, like any story worth telling, is all about a girl. Except, in the beginning, there had been no girl. There had just been the pain and sorrow, and the loss, and the spider." Chapter 1. The Arrival. It smelled weird. That was the first thing that Peter noticed. The moment he stepped over the threshold, he noticed the smell of the house. It was antiseptic somehow. Not that young Peter, standing there so neatly attired in his blue shorts, white shirt, and yellow sweater vest, would have known the word antiseptic. That was a big, important word. Most 4-year-olds hadn't heard the word, couldn't use it in context, couldn't even come close to spelling it. In this regard, Peter Parker, who had celebrated his birthday the previous August at a big and splendid party where his parents had made a marvelous fuss over him, was no different. By age 5, however, he would be able to correctly define it and spell it, along with microbiology, cellular, and mitosis. On the other hand, he would continue to stumble over photosynthesis and paleontologist until he reached the ripe old age of 6. Peter, however, wasn't looking that far ahead. 5 and 6 were an eternity away. All that concerned Peter at that moment was the here and now. and what was here and what wasn't. He was here. These strange people whom he had supposedly met once when he was a baby, but he sure couldn't remember, was here. That weird smell was here. His parents were not. The living room in which he was standing didn't seem even remotely inviting. The cushions of the couch were covered in plastic. He'd tried to sit on one and hadn't liked the way it had stuck to the underside of his legs. So he'd slid off it, but it had made this really weird, squeaky, ripping sound, and he hadn't liked that either. The man and woman who were bringing the last of his things into the house, who were speaking in hushed whispers to the woman named Mrs. Hemmings, the social worker she'd been called. Those people weren't paying any attention to him. That suited him fine. Perhaps he could simply reside there like a ghost, no one noticing him. When he was hungry, he could snitch food from the kitchen, presuming they had one, and otherwise be left alone. He wanted that more than anything, particularly to be left alone by the man who reminded him a little of his father. Except it wasn't him, and that made him feel all the more uneasy. The door closed, shutting out the outside world. The smell of the plastic cushions threatened to suffocate him. He would have screamed if he could have worked up the energy to do so, but he felt wrung out like a sponge. The carpet was weird, too. It felt slightly moist under his feet, as if it had just been washed. Just to add to the assault, there was a lemony smell coming from all the wood furniture. He stared down at his reflection on the coffee table. There were flowers arranged neatly on a small, lacy thing in the middle of it. He leaned forward to smell the flowers. The flowers, he realized belatedly, were fake. They were the only things in the whole living room that didn't smell. "Well, Peter," said the man, coming into the room. He clapped his hands once and rubbed them briskly together. The magician at Peter's birthday party had done something similar, right before he'd produced coins from out of somewhere. He'd pretended he'd pulled them from thin air, but Peter had spotted the sleight of hand. In a loud voice, he'd explained every single one of the magician's tricks, to the irritation of the conjurer and the endless amusement of his parents. His mother's laugh still rang in his ears. He hadn't yet been able to grasp the notion that he would never hear that laughter again. "Well, Peter," the man said again, "would you like to sit down?" "No, sir," Peter said politely, addressing the older man as sir, just as his parents had always taught him. "Land's sakes, child," the woman said. "You can't just plan to stand there forever. Why won't you sit?" He saw no reason to lie. "I don't like the plastic." "The plastic protects the cushions," she said reasonably. "You understand that, don't you, Peter?" "No, ma'am." "Oh." She seemed vaguely disappointed. He felt as if he'd let her down in some way. "Peter." And the man got down on one knee. Closer up, the resemblance between this man and Peter's father was more striking. He had that same square jaw, that same laughter in his eyes. His hair was a different color, more red in it, and his eyebrows were bushier. Peter's nostrils flared. The man smelled funny, too. "Why are you sniffing me, Peter? Are you part Cocker Spaniel?" "You have a funny smell, sir." "That would be my aftershave." "It was his Christmas present," the woman said proudly. She sat down on the couch, her hands neatly folded in her lap. The couch made that same weird plastic creaking sound when she sat on it. "Do you like it?" "Smells like poop, ma'am," Peter said. Her mouth immediately stretched to a thin line, while the man guffawed heartily. "He has his father's tact," the man said, and then immediately looked contrite. "I'm sorry, Peter. I spoke without thinking. Peter's eyebrows knit. You have to think to speak, don't you, sir? Less often than you've been led to believe. And please, Peter, call me Uncle Ben. Have you ever heard of your Uncle Ben? Encouraged by the boy's prompt nod, he said, What have you heard? That you make... He frowned, trying to recall the word. Perverted rice? Now it was the woman's turn to laugh, as Uncle Ben's cheeks reddened slightly. Different Uncle Ben, Peter. And I think you mean converted rice. Oh. He was studying the woman now, comparing her automatically to the only woman who'd had a major place in his life. Her face was narrower, her eyes a bit more sunken. Her hair, which was brown with gray streaks, was tied back in a severe bun. She had a long neck, and her hands tended to flutter toward it, as if she was trying to cool down waves of heat. Okay, he added, to fill the silence. I'm your Aunt May, she told him. She said this with a great deal of gravity, as if she were revealing one of the great secrets of the universe. Okay, he said again. The man clapped his hands together again. Peter waited for a dove to appear or a coin to drop out of the air. None was forthcoming. Would you like to see your room, Peter? Finally, something he understood. He nodded eagerly. Do you want to see where I drew some cowboys on the wall? He asked. Ben and May exchanged puzzled glances. What do you mean, Peter? Ben asked. Where I drew some cowboys. When I was little. Mommy yelled at me and tried to wash them off, but you can still see them, because I used markers. Oh, Ben said, and it sounded a little like a moan when he said it. Peter, I mean your new room. Here. Can I go back to my old room? Peter, dear, said May, and she took his hand in hers. Her hand felt cold but smooth, as if she'd put some sort of lotion on it. He noticed a few brown spots on the back of her hand and wondered what it would be like to connect them. Your old room is back in Wisconsin. I thought the social worker explained it. You'll be staying here in New York with us. Can't we stay at my house? But Peter, this is where we live. And this is where you're going to live now, Ben told him, trying desperately to sound upbeat about it. We'll make a good home for you. We'll make a good home here for you. Obviously, this Uncle Ben and Aunt May weren't getting it. I have a home, Peter explained, politely but firmly. Peter. You know what you need? Aunt May suddenly said briskly. She didn't clap and rub her hands. Instead, she patted them on her knees. Some nice, freshly baked cookies. Why don't you go upstairs and get your things unpacked, and I'll whip up some cookies. Do you like chocolate chip? When Peter nodded eagerly, she flicked a finger across the end of his nose in a playful manner. I thought you might. She rose as she asked, Is there anything else you'd like? Yes, please. And what would that be? She leaned over, hands resting on her knees. What would you like? My mommy and daddy. She winced at that, and Ben, trying to sound kindly but firm, said, Peter, you have to understand. You're going to live with us now. I don't want to, Peter told him firmly. He wasn't rude, wasn't whining or crying. He couldn't have been more polite if he'd been ordering a meal in a restaurant. I want my mommy and daddy. Please, he put in almost as an afterthought. They're not here, Peter, Ben began. Can I talk to them at least? Can you call them? Peter, and Ben took him firmly by the shoulders. Your parents, they're with God now. When are they coming back? Ben's lower lip was quivering. Peter had never seen a grown-up cry, and the feeling made his stomach queasy. He didn't think it was something that grown-ups did. Ben coughed loudly, took a deep breath, and said, "They're not coming back, Peter. I want to talk to them." "You can't. They went away." "I want to talk to them. Make them come back." "Peter, make them come back!" And the sound and agony that ripped from Peter's throat terrified the child himself, because he couldn't believe that it was his own voice sounding like that. His eyes went wide, pupils tiny and swimming in a sea of white. And without another word, he turned and bolted up the nearby steps. Looking a lot older than he had a few minutes earlier, Ben turned to May and sighed dryly. "Well, that went well." Peter sat on the floor in the middle of the room, his eyes drawn up to just under his chin. He could have been a statue. He was that immobile. The room itself wasn't terrible, but it didn't feel especially warm. In Peter's room, his real room, all the furniture kind of looked like it went together. Here it seemed as if some random stuff had been stuck together in one place. At least none of it was covered in plastic. Uncle Ben had brought up the last of his suitcases some time ago. Peter hadn't spoken to him. The truth was, he was embarrassed about his outburst and was quite certain that Uncle Ben was angry with him. So he had felt it wisest not to say anything and hope that, eventually, Uncle Ben would forget that he had shouted in such an inappropriate manner. That's what his mother would have said. Inappropriate, young man, with her finger waggling one quick downward stroke on every syllable. Uncle Ben didn't try to strike up a conversation with him. He didn't seem to know what to say. For his part, Peter was busy focusing all his attention on the spider that was up in the corner of his room. It was quite big, hanging in the middle of an intricately designed web that stretched from the edge of the ceiling down to the upper portion of the wall. He had never seen anything so morbidly curious. On the one hand, it was incredibly ugly. On the other, it possessed such an elegant beauty that he couldn't look away. So Uncle Ben would come and go from the room, grunting slightly and wondering out loud why Peter was packing anvils in his suitcases, which puzzled Peter, who couldn't remember bringing any, while Peter sat there and watched the spider. The sun moved across the sky, the shadows lengthened. Uncle Ben stopped coming in and out, and Peter and the spider stared at each other until time ceased to have any meaning. The smell of fresh-baked cookies wafted upstairs, seeping in through the doorway and wrapping the tempting fingers of their aroma around him. For a moment he was sorely tempted to abandon his vigil, which had boiled down to waiting for the spider to move. He resisted, however, although he did shift his posture so that he was sitting cross-legged. Finally, he heard footsteps again. He recognized them as belonging to Uncle Ben, but he didn't bother to turn around. Then he heard his uncle chuckling softly, and that distracted him. He swiveled his head and regarded his uncle, who was standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, his arms folded. He was holding a small, wire-bound book tucked under his right arm. "What's funny?" asked Peter. "You just remind me so much of Ricky, that's all," said Uncle Ben. "Same serious face. I'll show you pictures of him at your age if you want." "Who's Ricky?" Richard, your dad." Peter blinked in confusion. "How come you know my dad?" Uncle Ben's jaw dropped. How come Peter, he said in astonishment. And then he sat down on the floor with Peter, just like his mom and dad used to. Peter, your dad, he was my little brother. Didn't you understand that? Peter shook his head. I thought you were my uncle. I am. An uncle or an aunt is what you call someone who is a brother or sister of a parent. In this case, your father. Peter frowned, digesting that bit of information. So Aunt May is my dad's sister? Ben made that odd sound that was a combination of laughter and a cough. Peter, Aunt May is my wife. You married your sister? Peter was by now hopelessly confused. No, Peter. Rubbing the bridge of his nose between beefy fingers, Ben said, We call her your aunt because she's married to me, which is the other way someone can be an aunt or uncle. By marriage. Understand? I guess so, said Peter, who thought he did but wasn't 100% sure. Then he took a deep breath and let it out unsteadily. My mom and dad aren't coming back, are they? No, Peter, Ben told him as gently as he could. They were killed in an airplane crash. It was an accident. No, Peter said flatly. It wasn't. It wasn't? Said Ben curiously. Peter shoved his hand into one of the bags and extracted a stack of comic books. They were secret heroes, like spies, and they were helping their country, and a bad guy, like the Red Skull, killed them. He held up an old issue of a comic, spine-rolled and tattered. Ben flattened it carefully and looked at the cover. Captain America. You like these old comic book heroes? Peter bobbed his head. And you think your mom and dad were like that? Why? Because they were special. Too special to get killed in a stupid airplane accident. I see, said Ben very seriously. That's an interesting possibility you got there, Peter. I'll have to think about that one. Peter nodded and, satisfied that the conversation was over, went back to what he was doing, namely watching the corner of the room. I see you have a roommate, Ben commented after a time. Heck of a spider. They're good luck, you know. They are? That surprised Peter. His mother had always hated them and called on his father to squish them whenever one happened to wander unwarily into the house. Oh, yes. They eat harmful bugs like mosquitoes. They protect people. That's what they are, Peter. Protectors. They're helpful. And in this world, folks need all the help they can get. Right? Right, Peter agreed. Who knows? Maybe my brother, your dad, sent him to watch over you. Maybe, said Peter. He was looking back at Ben, staring at him as if seeing him for the first time. I thought only kids had brothers, he said. No, grown-ups have them too. I brought you something. He took out the notebook that he tucked under his arm and handed it to Peter. Here you go. Peter turned it over and over, then opened it. There's nothing in it, he said curiously. I know that. It's for you to write in. You see, he shifted on the floor, perhaps to make himself comfortable, or perhaps because he felt uncertain of exactly what to say next. You said you wanted to talk to your folks. Well, they're in heaven now, Peter. But they can see you. They can see whatever you're doing, and they're watching you all the time. They are? Peter asked, looking around, brushing a hank of tousled hair from his face. "Oh, yes. And if you write to them in this book, they can see it. So it's just like talking to them." Peter stared at the pages, running his hands over the paper respectfully. "But what will I write to them? Say to them?" "Whatever you want. Tell them about how things are going with you. About your life, about school. Whatever you want." "Can I tell them I wish they were here?" "As much as you want." Ben smiled, resting a hand on Peter's shoulder. Peter considered it a moment more. "If I'm talking to them," he said at last, "how will I know when they're talking back? Will I hear them?" "You won't hear 'em with these," he said, tapping his ears. Then he reached down and tapped Peter's chest gently. "You'll hear them with this." "My heart? Who listens with their heart instead of their ears?" "The wisest men in the world, Peter. The wisest men in the world. And I think you can be one of them." "Oh." He riffled through the pages once more. They made a most satisfying noise as he slid them across his thumb. Then he frowned. "Uncle Ben, I don't know how to write." Ah. Apparently Ben hadn't remembered that. "Well, tell you what," he said after pondering the problem. "At first you can tell me what you want to say, and I'll write it for you. As you get older, you can write it yourself. How's that?" Peter's head bobbed up and down. The entire idea sounded rather exciting to him. The notion that his parents could be watching right over his shoulder, without being seen, was an exciting one. It made them almost like invisible heroes or something. More importantly, it eased, ever so slightly, the aching melancholy that had threatened to overwhelm him. Uncle Ben pulled out a ballpoint, balanced the notebook carefully on his knees, and waited expectantly for Peter to start talking. He had a very serious demeanor, like an executive secretary about to take dictation from the President of the United States. "Mom and Dad," Peter said finally, "I love you and I miss you. Maybe I'll see you soon. Uncle Ben is nice." And he glanced surreptitiously at his uncle to see his reaction. The only hint of it was the edges of his mouth twitching upward. Peter took that as a good sign. "Aunt May is nice too. I think she made cookies. They smell good." "They are good," Ben assured him under his breath. "Uncle Ben says they're good. I think maybe I'll have one, if that's okay. But I won't sit on the couch or chair or anything to eat them, because I don't like how they feel." "You know what? Neither do I," said Ben, even as he continued to write. He spoke very distantly, as if thinking aloud. "I think I'll have a chat with your aunt about removing them. No reason we can't make the house a little more little boy friendly." "That'd be good," Peter said. Ben hesitated, waited. "Anything else you want to say?" he inquired. "No, that's all for now," said Peter after thinking about it a little. They went downstairs and had cookies and milk while Aunt May insisted she would attend to putting away all of Peter's clothes, just to help him feel more at home. Uncle Ben kept telling Peter how pleased he was to see Peter's mood improve, and how they were going to be great friends and a great family. Just you wait and see. Peter's spirits improved with each bite of a cookie and each sip of milk. It was the warmth of the freshly baked cookie versus the chill of the refrigerated milk. And the warmth won out, giving him a pleasant feeling in the pit of his stomach. Then he went upstairs, and the first thing he noticed was that the spider was gone. "Oh, that awful thing," said Aunt May. "Don't worry, Peter. I vacuumed it right up. That nasty spider is dead." For the next hour, it was very difficult to hear the shouts of, "Thanks a lot, May," and "How was I supposed to know?" over Peter's pained howls. It took a full day of coaxing and an entire tray of brownies to get Peter to even talk to his Aunt May, and even then there was occasional snuffling or hurt looks. As time passed, the relationship between Peter and his aunt and uncle smoothed out and became a consistent and loving one. His relationships with the rest of the world, on the other hand, were a bit more problematic. Chapter 2. The Departure. Why did I listen to her? Peter Parker adored Mary Jane Watson. There was no question in his mind about that. She was, indeed, hard not to adore, with that luscious red hair, with that exquisite mouth that could start as a pout that could crush your heart, then transform into a smile that would send it soaring into the stratosphere, with those stunning green eyes that could evoke a spring day in the dead of winter, with that laughter as light as a meringue. From head to toe, the girl was as close to absolute perfection as any high school senior girl could be. She had just one teeny tiny little problem. The girl had no sense of time. Like, at all. Not only that, but she could never remember times that were told to her. Times of meetings, of appointments, of tests. There and gone. Her mind was filled with the simple joys of living each day to the fullest, and didn't do well with being bound by such inconveniences as deadlines. Timeliness was for lesser mortals. So what in the hell had possessed Peter to believe her for so much as a microsecond when she said that the bus for the field trip left the school at precisely 8:30 that Friday morning? Probably because he'd seen her the previous day, late in the afternoon. This wasn't all that unusual an occurrence, considering that she lived in the house opposite his, their backyards adjoining. Nevertheless, even though he'd known her for 12 years since she had moved in at the age of 6, Peter had had occasional bouts of being tongue-tied around her. This had been one of those times. She'd been weeding in the garden in the postage stamp-sized backyard, and noticed Peter coming out of his house to get a hammer from the tool shed for Uncle Ben. She'd waved to him, he had waved back. Then she had stood up, dusting off her hands with an air of having finished her task, and picked up a small stack of books. But rather than going into her house, an off-white A-frame with red shutters, she'd simply stood there, her arms wrapped around the books. He'd had a feeling she was waiting for him to say something, so he'd said the first thing that popped into his mind. "When are we supposed to be at the school again for the science class trip?" Without hesitation, she'd replied, 8:30. Then she'd flashed that gorgeous smile. "In the morning?" he asked, and then immediately mentally kicked himself for such an utterly lame follow-up. "Well, yeah. We don't do that many class trips at 8:30 at night." Right. He ran his fingers through his dark hair and shuffled his toe on the sidewalk. "You're shuffling your toe? What are you, an infant? This is Mary Jane Watson. MJ, the woman you've loved since before you even liked girls. Say something, for the love of God, something intelligent." "Well, later," he said, and immediately he pivoted on his heel, ran inside, and sprinted up the steps to his room, and thudded his head repeatedly against a wall that already had a bunch of peculiar marks that constantly mystified his Aunt May. So it was that 8:30 lodged in his brain, and when he arrived at Midtown High at 8:25, it was just in time to see the yellow Laidlaw school bus hanging a left turn out of the parking lot and heading off down Woodhaven Boulevard. "Aw, crap!" Peter howled, and he started to sprint. He was grateful that, A year ago, he had actually managed to convince Aunt May to let him start wearing sneakers to school. Through his junior year, she had insisted that school was where you wore some of your best clothes, second only to your Sunday go-to-meeting clothes, whatever those were. Aunt May had this occasionally annoying habit of talking like she'd stepped out of a Mark Twain book. Every time she'd say something like, "Land's sakes," he half expected to be able to look out the back window and see a paddle wheeler cruising up the mighty Mississippi, instead of the tree-lined streets of Queens that typified their Forest Hills neighborhood. So if it had been a year ago, he would have been trying to hot-foot it after a bus wearing a pair of neatly tied Oxfords, slipping like a madman on the highly polished soles. Fortunately enough, he was wearing a good pair of running shoes instead, which was what he was going to need if he had any hope in hell of catching up. The bus was inching its way up Woodhaven, which gave Peter cause for hope. But then a car, which had been in the process of parallel parking and thus holding up traffic, finally managed to angle its way into the space, and the bus took off like a rabbit. With a choked groan, Peter sped up. The bus driver turned onto Queens Boulevard and started to open her up. Most mornings, Queens Boulevard would be choked with traffic. Today, naturally, it looked like the Wall Street area on Easter Sunday. The school bus chugged along the outer road of Queens Boulevard, picking up speed, and Peter's lungs were slamming against his ribs. A kid in the bus saw him. He pointed out Peter to another kid, and within moments, all eyes were on him. For one fleeting moment, Peter Parker thought he was going to catch a break. And then the sounds of laughter and taunting floated through the air toward him. The bus, which had started to slow for a red light, lurched forward when it abruptly changed to green, and a belch of smoke erupted from the tailpipe. Peter held his breath as he ran through it. One inhalation and it would probably have collapsed his lungs. This sign of open disrespect from the bus itself only jacked up the amusement level among the kids, who laughed even harder at his predicament. His book bag was slamming against his back as he ran. He shouldn't have even brought the stupid thing, but no, he'd had to decide that he might as well bring stuff to read on the trip. Try to get ahead on some courses. Peter Parker, the big brain who just couldn't get enough of books that he had to haul them along on a class trip. Part of him wanted to pitch the stupid things down the nearest sewer, but he continued to clutch them tightly. His large rectangular glasses were bouncing around on the end of his nose. Twice they almost slid off as his face became drenched in perspiration. With his luck, they'd fall off and he'd wind up trampling them. Wouldn't that cause unbridled hilarity for the troglodytes that constituted the senior class? The bus put its left signal on. It was about to shift lanes, to move into the Queens Boulevard Express lane. If it did that, he was finished. The only way he'd catch up with it under those circumstances would be with a rocket. That was when he heard a female voice. The female voice. And even though the motor of the bus was roaring, and even though all the kids were hooting and hollering, she made herself audible over the hullabaloo. "Stop the bus!" came Mary Jane's voice. "He's been chasing us since Woodhaven Boulevard." This caused a collective and disappointed "Aww" from the kids on the bus. Naturally, Mary Jane had terminated the fun before it had led to something really entertaining, like a coronary or a blood vessel exploding in his head. The bus slowed, and for a moment, Peter thought it was yet another tease, another false hope. But then it glided over to the curbside, and the doors opened to admit him. Peter nearly collapsed on the first step, clutching the handrail. The bus driver looked down at him, not with concern, but with undiluted annoyance, obviously irritated that this idiot teenager had disrupted her carefully prepared schedule. "Thanks," Peter managed to gasp out. The driver grunted, shoving forward on the bar and slamming the door shut behind him while he was still in the stairwell. She didn't even wait for him to get into the body of the bus as she pulled the bus forward, grumbling to herself in a steady stream of indecipherable muttering. Peter staggered forward, fighting not only his own exhaustion and pounding heart, but the swaying of the bus as it practically vaulted into the express lane and hurtled forward. He bumped against kids who were seated and muttered, sorry, to each one as he went. He got a particularly nasty look from his teacher, Mr. Sullivan. Peter always got nervous when he looked at Mr. Sullivan, with his thick glasses, thinning hair, and expression of perpetual pain, because Peter couldn't help but worry that he was looking at a future version of himself. It was a disconcerting, even terrifying thought. Mr. Sullivan gestured impatiently for Peter to go find a seat, then looked down at his clipboard with such intensity that Peter felt as if he was in the midst of translating a newly found section of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Peter glanced over Sullivan's shoulder and saw a list of the students' names on it. Sullivan was putting a little black X next to Peter's name. That can't be good, Peter thought. Seated about 3/4 of the way down was Liz Allen. She had a mouthful of braces, glasses thicker than Peter's, and blonde hair so wiry that it could have scoured clean a pan with 2 inches of hardened grease on it. She had books with her, and here Peter had thought he was the only one obsessive enough to bring along stuff to read. The seat next to her was empty. Peter, his legs weak, made eye contact with her. She promptly slammed the armload of books down into the space and fixed him with a fearsome glare that could have chilled the sun. "Don't even think about it," she growled. Wonderful. Liz was to the high school social whirl what the foxtrot was to a mosh pit. Yet even she was concerned enough about her standing in the Midtown High community that she didn't want to share a seat with him. As he made his way down the aisle, he couldn't help but wonder what he'd done to deserve this. Was he really that ghastly looking? He caught a glimpse of himself in one of the windows as he passed. Granted, the window was covered with grime and dead bugs, but even with all of that, he wasn't that ugly. His face was round, his attitude honest and open. He was physically unimposing. Some would call him scrawny, but he preferred the term svelte or lean. And in his eyes, well, he thought his eyes were his best feature. Deep blue and filled as if they were with quiet intelligence and authority. Oh, well, and isn't that just what high schoolers adore? Intelligence and authority. Intelligence blows the bell curve, and authority is what teens are supposed to rebel against. And here came Peter Parker, the living personification of both. And with all that taken into consideration, it was a wonder that he was still walking around at all. And then, without warning, he was on the floor. At first, he had no idea how it happened. It had occurred so quickly that his mind didn't have the time to process it. All he knew was that one moment he was making his way down the aisle, and the next he was flat on the floor. Unsurprisingly, it was filthy, littered with gum wrappers, candy wrappers, stray bits of food, and detritus that had been laying there for who knows how long. To add to this joy, he had banged his elbows severely when he'd hit, and the pain running up and down his arms was excruciating. More painful, however, was the humiliation, and the stinging of the blood rushing into his cheeks was the sharpest pain of all. Because Peter knew that he hadn't simply stumbled, he'd been tripped. He twisted himself around, shoving his glasses back into place as he looked up with pure, unbridled fury at the occupant of the seat he'd just gone by. Sure enough, Flash Thompson. Flash Thompson, the swaggering, arrogant, overarching, self-confident football hero, with a heart the size of all outdoors and compassion to match, if all outdoors happened to be the Arctic Circle. As far as Peter was concerned, Flash was living proof against Darwinism, because Flash was obviously a throwback to an earlier era, and if Neanderthals were anything like Flash, then mankind could never have evolved. Neander Flash and his caveman cohorts would have made life for any new species an endless torture of trip-ups, poundings, wedgies, and verbal taunting. "You put the homo in Homo sapiens." They'd doubtless be shouting, grunting, and howling. The best and brightest future incarnations of man would have scampered back up the trees, never to descend again. Oh, and they'd get the best women. They just overwhelm them with their raw animal magnetism, sling them over their shoulders, and swagger away. Case in point, Mary Jane was sitting next to Flash. She clearly hadn't seen that Flash had been responsible for sending Peter tumbling to the floor, but she was regarding him with clear suspicion. Flash, his hands upturned in a gesture of total innocence, was saying, "What?" And why shouldn't he? Even his lowbrow intelligence was enough to assure himself that Peter wouldn't rat him out. And he was right. The only thing worse than the way this morning was going would be for Peter to point accusingly and say, "He tripped me." How utterly lame, how whining would that sound? No, Peter had to suck it up, which was what he did. Without a word, he staggered to his feet and fired Flash the fiercest, angriest look he could. This intimidated Thompson about as much as could be expected. He curled his lip contemptuously and turned back to Mary Jane, making a point of draping an arm around her shoulders. There was an empty seat toward the back on the right. It was one of the 2 seats that nobody ever wanted to sit in, directly over the rear wheels. It hit all the bumps and potholes, jostled constantly, and was, in short, the most uncomfortable seat in the house. Peter, sliding into self-pity, exiled himself there. No one gave him a second glance. Alone amongst a crowd, Peter did what he frequently did under such circumstances. He pulled out a small journal from between 2 larger books and laid it neatly on his lap, balancing it with accomplished expertise. The journal looked identical to the one that Uncle Ben had bought him over a decade ago, but it had the number 29 neatly inscribed in the upper right-hand corner of the cover. It was the 29th journal that he'd started since his youth. It was fortunate that Uncle Ben had purchased a common and popular brand of notebook. It gave him a sort of continuity between the young man he'd been and, with any luck, the old man he would become. It made him feel almost like a time traveler. Writing on the bouncing bus was no easy thing, and this wouldn't be one of his neater entries. Then again, compared to the chicken scratchings from when he was 6 and still trying to master cursive style, it would be a masterwork. He dated the page and wrote, "Mom and Dad. Well, it happened again. Flash made me look like an idiot in front of MJ, and she didn't even realize it was him. I don't understand it. I have about 100 times his brain power, but he gets the best of me every time. Uncle Ben says you can beat ignorant people by outsmarting them, outthinking them, and arrogant people by appealing to that arrogance and using it against them. But that people who are arrogant and ignorant are the toughest to deal with. And the worst is that he sits there with MJ. That's killing me. I don't think he even really likes her. Not really likes her. He treats her like she's a trophy or something. Like, since he's the best athlete and everything, he deserves to have the best-looking girl in the whole school. Like it's divine right or entitlement or something. When it comes down to it, Flash Thompson doesn't love anyone as much as he loves himself. She's there to make him look good. She must know that. She's got to know that. So why the heck does she put up with him? Why does she even like him? She deserves so much better than him. Mom, Dad, you know I don't ask favors of you, hardly ever. But the next time you're sitting around shooting the breeze with God, do you think maybe you might mention Flash to him and ask for some divine intervention? Nothing fancy, nothing extraordinary. An anvil, maybe, 100 pounds. On second thought, better make it 500 pounds. With his thick skull, he probably won't feel anything less. Whatever it takes. In short, any strings you could pull that would provide a little balance, a little justice, would be greatly appreciated. Harry Osborn shifted uncomfortably in the back of the chauffeur-driven Bentley, sneaking looks at his father, Norman, while fervently wishing that he was somewhere else. anywhere else at this particular moment in time. Norman Osborn, for his part, hadn't glanced at Harry for the last 20 blocks. Instead, he'd been utterly absorbed in coordinating his day of meetings via his handheld PDA. Harry's attempt at casual conversation had been met with occasional grunts or nods, and not much more. Osborn the Elder exuded an odd mix of power and barely controlled anger. Harry had never been able to figure out just with whom his father was mad exactly. The world, it seemed. He was frustrated at all he wished to accomplish, and able to focus only on failures rather than successes. And Harry was often the target of his misplaced frustration. At least, that was what Harry chose to believe. He had never forgotten that time, on his 16th birthday. His father had thrown a sizable bash, with a guest list comprised mostly of Norman's friends, with a couple of Harry's friends du jour tossed in for appearances. It was more a business opportunity for strategic meeting and greeting, but Norman had gotten himself seriously liquored up as the evening progressed. That was unusual for him. Usually he prided himself on total control. Late in the evening, however, Harry had found himself alone in a hallway, with his dad hanging with one arm on his son and speaking in a voice filled with alcohol and contempt. "I look at you, Harry," he said, "and I see myself at your age, except without the potential for greatness." Harry had gone to bed shortly thereafter, and hadn't come out for 2 days, claiming a headache. His father, mortified over what he'd said while in his cups, finally coaxed him out of his room with a dirt bike he'd been coveting and a vacation to the mountains. It had been a glorious outing, but the circumstances behind it still rankled. As the Bentley approached the curbside of Columbia University, Harry could see the kids offloading from the school bus onto the sidewalk. He wished for all the world that he'd been able to ride along with the other kids. Norman had put a quick end to that notion, of course. No son of his rode creaky, dirty, disgusting school buses. What if someone he knew saw Harry on it? The limousine window was slightly rolled down, and he could hear the teacher, Mr. Sullivan, shouting in his perpetually put-upon voice, "Okay, people, no wandering. Proceed directly up to the—" "Knock it the hell off!" he bellowed as the teen horseplay, laughter, and shouting reached terminal levels. For a microsecond, he had caught their attention, and he continued in that same tone. "Up the steps and into the building." But then all eyes turned toward the Bentley. Harry wanted to sink into his seat, through it, and into the trunk. Hoping to salvage the situation, he muttered, "Dad, could you drive around the corner?" Norman glanced up from his work toward the entrance to the building. "Why? The door's right there," he said. Harry lowered his voice to an urgent whisper, as if the kids could somehow hear them from outside. He saw that they were congregating into one lump of curiosity focused entirely on him. "These are public school kids," he reminded his father. "I'm not showing up to school in a Bentley." Norman Osborn laughed bitterly. "What? You want me to trade in my car for a Jetta just because you flunked out of every private school I sent you to?" Harry winced at that. The only thing worse than the reproach in his father's voice was the knowledge that his dad was right. Trying to mount some sort of defense, he said, "They weren't for me. I told you that. It wasn't for me." "Of course it was," Norman shot back. But then, seeing Harry flinch at the abruptness, he sighed and then smiled wanly. He reached across Harry to unlatch the door on his side. "Don't ever be ashamed of who you are," he said, not unkindly. "Dad, I'm not ashamed. I'm just not what you—" Norman frowned. "What, Harry?" he asked, trying to get to the source of his son's discomfort. "Forget it, Dad," he sighed, sliding out of the car. He squinted as his eyes had to adjust from seeing the world through the smoked glass of the Bentley to being assailed by the brightness of the sun on the crisp autumn morning. He stepped onto the curb, bobbing his head slightly in recognition of the awed and impressed expressions on the kids' faces. They were approaching the car as if it was the Holy Grail, which made Harry even more uncomfortable. He'd been speaking the truth to his father. He had never felt like he fit in at private school. Now his money and status was going to set him apart in public school as well. "Hiya, Harry," said a familiar voice. He felt a quick surge of relief as Peter Parker stepped out of the crowd. Immediately, Harry noticed that the knees of Peter's pants were dirty, as if he'd taken a spill. Well, he could always ask him about it later. "Hey, Peter," he said. Then Harry remembered. He'd borrowed some science books from Peter and had intended to return them this morning, but he'd left them in the car. He started to turn back to the Bentley to get them, but his heart sank as the other back door opened and Norman Osborn stepped out. He didn't so much emerge from the car as grow from it, as if he were an extension of the power and prestige such a vehicle afforded. He was holding the book bag. "Won't you be needing this?" he inquired. He handed the bag to Harry, but his gaze was riveted on Peter, sizing up the person who had addressed Harry in such a friendly and outgoing manner. Realizing that an introduction was not only required but inevitable, Harry cleared his throat and said, "Peter, this is my father, Norman Osborn." "Great honor to meet you," Peter said, shaking Norman's hand. He winced a bit. Norman laughed good-naturedly. "Oh, come on, son. You call that a handshake? A man is judged by the strength of his grip. Let's see what you got." Peter made an obvious effort, and Harry couldn't watch. Instead, he looked around at the girls who were gathering around the Bentley, oohing and awing. He couldn't help but notice that Mary Jane Watson was one of them, looking at the car almost reverentially, as if it was the most magnificent thing she'd ever seen. He made a mental note of that. It might be that showing up in such a fancy vehicle might not have been such a bad thing after all. Apparently, Peter had made a worthy enough effort, because Norman nodded approvingly and released his hand. "I've heard a lot about you. Harry tells me you're quite the science whiz." "Well, I don't know about that." Quickly, Harry said. "He's being modest. I told you, Dad, he's won all the prizes." With a touch of reproach, Norman said, "Anyone who can get Harry to pass chemistry shouldn't be modest." "Harry's really smart. He didn't really need my help." "Harry's really smart. He didn't really need my help." "We have to go, Dad," Harry said. But Norman obviously found conversation with Peter too engaging to end it quickly. "You know, I'm something of a scientist myself," Norman said with genuine enthusiasm. "I know," Peter said immediately. "I know all about Oscorp. You guys are designing the guidance and re-entry systems for the first shuttle mission to Mars. Really brilliant." Norman blinked in surprise at Peter's obvious and total knowledge of everything that his corporation was up to. "Impressive. Your parents must be proud." Sounding slightly apologetic, Peter said, "I live with my aunt and uncle. They're very proud." The girls were now moving away from the Bentley at the urging of Mr. Sullivan, who was trying to herd them up the steps into the building. "What about your folks?" Harry wanted to say something to get Peter off the hook, but Peter took a deep breath and said, "My parents died when I was little." Norman seemed a bit taken aback by this, and when he spoke again, he sounded sympathetic. "I lost my parents as a young boy as well." Harry, sounding a bit more sarcastic than he would have liked, said, "Which no doubt strengthened your iron will to succeed, huh, Dad?" From the door at the top of the steps, Mr. Sullivan, looking on the verge of apoplexy, called down, "Hey, you two, I'm closing the door." Norman released his grip on Harry's shoulder, and it was all he could do not to sag in relief. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Osborn," Peter said. "See you again," Norman assured him before sliding back into the Bentley. Mary Jane was standing near Flash, but watching the Bentley as it pulled away. She shifted her gaze to Harry, and suddenly Harry felt a lot more powerful, really, than he had before. Radiating confidence in a manner that would have made his father proud, Harry said, "Hi." She smiled back. That alone was enough to put some additional spring in his step. And then she moved away, Flash blocking her from view. The class was standing in a corridor with arched ceilings, lined with neatly framed portraits of various scientists, or reproductions of noted scientific documents. Sunlight filtered in through a series of skylights, and the acoustics were terrific as far as the kids were concerned, and a horror show as far as Mr. Sullivan and other chaperones were concerned. As their voices reverberated up and down the hallway, the frantic shushing from the adults only made things worse. "He doesn't seem so bad," Peter said, standing at Harry's right shoulder. Harry looked at him in confusion, not entirely certain who he was. Then he realized that Peter was talking about his father, and it was all he could do to suppress a laugh. "Not if you're a genius," he said ruefully. "I think he wants to adopt you." Then Harry noticed that Peter was looking beyond him, and turned to see that his friend was staring at Mary Jane. Flash had drifted away. Apparently a rendering of Da Vinci's famed drawing of man was one of the most hilarious things he'd ever seen, and was laughing it up with his friends. Mary Jane, for her part, was about 2 feet away from Peter, studying a portrait of Isaac Newton. As intrigued as Harry was with Mary Jane, he knew 2 things beyond question. First, that Peter had been interested in her far longer. And second, that any guy who tried to take her away from Flash Thompson would probably get himself killed. Still, it might be worth the risk, provided MJ was actually interested in breaking it off with Thompson, the id that walked like a man. Better for his long-term health, Harry realized, if Peter were used for the litmus test of MJ's availability rather than Harry himself. Not that Harry had any intention of sending his friend into danger. Certainly if push came to shove, particularly shove through the wall, Harry could intercede and charm, i.e. bribe, Flash out of it. Harry snapped his fingers in front of Peter's face to catch his attention. "Hey," he whispered, and nodding toward Mary Jane, said, "Say something." Peter squared his shoulders, which struck Harry as rather funny. Peter couldn't have looked more serious if he had been preparing to enter a ring with a maddened bull armed with only a dish towel. He approached Mary Jane, who saw him coming, turned and smiled that million-watt smile at him. No wonder, Harry mused, that her last name was Watson. She looked expectantly from Peter to Harry, and then back to Peter, and Harry waited for his friend to say something. And waited. And waited. The moment morphed from energy charge to awkward. Mary Jane tilted her head slightly, expectantly, like a dog trying to pick up a high-pitched noise. Desperate to have matters progress, Harry stepped forward and said to MJ, "Hi, how you doing?" Mary Jane smiled in return. "Hey," she said conversationally, and waited once more for Peter to say something. It was difficult for Harry to get a read off her. It could be she was just being friendly, or there might be some interest. He needed Peter to keep it going in order to tell for sure. Peter's jaw twitched once, twice more, which was good since it indicated that he was in fact alive. Then he walked away as quickly as he could. MJ looked to Harry quizzically, and he made a vague noise in his throat and hurried off after Peter. The moment he drew alongside him, he asked in annoyance, "Why didn't you say something?" "I was about to," Peter said defensively. "It wasn't the right moment." Looking around for some sort of exit, he ducked into the nearby men's room, leaving Harry shaking his head. Suddenly, a very large shadow was cast over Harry. He turned and looked up, at Flash, and for a moment wondered if there might be a problem, wondered if Flash had figured out what he was up to. But Flash quickly disabused him of that notion. The jock was obviously only capable of figuring something out, if it involved tormenting someone smaller than he. "Explain me something, Osborn," he said. "Not sure I have enough small words," he thought, but said gamely, "Sure, Flash, what?" "You and Parker. I mean, he's such a loner, and you're Mr. Mega-Rich Dad and riding around in a Rolls-Royce." That was a Bentley. "Whatever," Flash said impatiently. "The point is, why do you bother hanging around with the guy? What's the big attraction? You and Parker ain't, And he flipped one hand forward and down in a decidedly limp-wristed manner. "Huh? No!" said Harry with extreme vehemence. "No, it's nothing like that. It's... Look, you really want to know?" "I asked, didn't I?" Flash's disposition wasn't improving. Harry glanced right and left to make sure no one was paying attention, and was sufficiently satisfied with Mr. Sullivan's fruitless endeavors to get everyone to pay attention. He was reasonably sure they could chat undisturbed for a few moments. "Okay, look. My previous schools, all the best preppy private schools there were, I got bounced out of them, okay? I couldn't cut it scholastically. In point of fact, I didn't even want to." Flash let out a whistle. "I wondered how you wound up at our dump of a school." "Yeah, well, if I'd been left on my own, I'd probably have flunked out of yours too." He leaned against the wall, shifting uncomfortably, as if his shoes were suddenly too tight. "I'd been at Midtown for about 2 weeks, and I had this biology report due. I didn't have a clue how to approach it, so I figured I'd do what I always do when I run into a problem: throw money at it. I tracked down Parker, the biggest brain in school, and offered to buy a biology paper off him. He writes it, I sign my name, pay him off, everyone's happy." "I get it. So you're Parker's meal ticket." Flash grinned broadly, as if pleased to learn that Peter Parker's feet were as made of clay as any other guy's. But Harry shook his head vehemently. No, not at all. Because Peter wouldn't do it. He says it's wrong. He says it won't accomplish anything. I double the offer. $200, I offered him. He still won't take it. I say, "What, you don't need any money?" "More than you know, but that would be wrong," he says to me. Instead, he says to me, "Look, I'll help you do it yourself. Help you pick a topic, show you how to research it, the whole 9 yards. And I'll proofread the paper for you once you've written it. Make sure all the facts are right. That way, it's really your paper and it's all above board." I ask him, "How much will that run me?" And he says, "Nothing." I say, "So why would you do this for me?" He says, "Because you look like you need the help, and that would be right." So I take him up on it, because I figure I can still talk him into it. The thing is, thanks to him, I really started getting into it. As I found out stuff in my research, I really did get excited about the idea of seeing it through. For maybe the first time in my life, in fact. So I did, and I got a B+, and it was the sweetest grade I ever got because it was mine. And Peter never took a dime from me. You see, Flash, most people are like you. They see me, they see a walking dollar sign. Not Peter. He's barely got 2 nickels to rub together. But I realized, thanks to hanging out with him, that some things like integrity are beyond price. He put a hand on Flash's upper arm and cringed slightly as he felt the rock-solid muscle beneath the shirt sleeve. "You hear what I'm telling you, Flash? Does that tell you something about Peter Parker?" "Yeah," said Flash with a snort. "Parker's even dumber than I thought. Walking away from $200. He probably would have enjoyed writing the stupid paper, and he would have had you as a customer for the rest of high school. What a jerk." Harry moaned, closing his eyes and shaking his head. "No, Flash, I think you kind of missed the point. The only point that matters is the one on top of puny Parker's pointed head. What a maroon. What a ta-ra-ra-goondier." Harry stopped talking, realizing that nothing he was going to say would change Flash's mind about Peter. Indeed, it was possible that nothing in existence would do that, short of Peter caving in Flash's face. But as Flash swaggered over to Mary Jane, draping an arm around her as if she were a side of beef, Harry realized that the odds of Peter ever laying out Flash were very, very slim indeed. The Ascot Club, situated in a neatly adorned brownstone on Lexington Avenue, was one of those men's clubs that seemed hopelessly out of date. That, of course, was exactly what its uniformly male membership enjoyed about the place. All one had to do was walk in and take a deep breath. It was easy to detect, with just one whiff, the history. Pipes, fine cigars, and testosterone that filled the atmosphere. There was a sense of gravitas in the air, and a serene quiet. In a number of rooms, discussion was banned entirely, allowing blissful silence to hold sway. Norman Osborn wasn't especially in the mood to talk, but all the truly comfortable chairs in the silent areas were taken. So he had opted to settle into an overstuffed easy chair in the far corner of one of the conversational rooms and bury his face behind a newspaper in hopes of being left on his own. This hope proved to be futile, though, although at least it made a perverse sort of sense when he was interrupted. "At least you're reading my newspaper, Norman. I appreciate the show of solidarity." Osborn folded the Daily Bugle in half and looked with surprise at the person who had addressed him. "Jonah," he exclaimed. "A bit early in the morning for you, isn't it?" J. Jonah Jameson, publisher of the Daily Bugle, didn't need the excuse of his club to puff away on a cigar. He did so whenever and wherever he was inclined, ignoring everything from prohibitive signs to city laws. But he'd been heard to say that, at his club at least, he could smoke without having to worry about getting dirty looks. Jameson's face had a lived-in look. He had a habit of walking in with his chin thrust out, like a boxer daring people to take their best shots. Jonah Jameson also had say on any number of occasions that he led a life without apology. It had been observed by others that he didn't need to apologize. That's what he had a staff for. In contrast to the impeccable designer suit that Osborn was sporting, Jameson was attired in one of his customary ill-fitting gray off-the-rack things that looked like he'd slept in it for 2 days. Since he seemed to spend every waking hour either in the office or at the club, he might very well have been sleeping in it. It was a total mystery to Osborn how anyone with as much money as Jameson could pay so little attention to personal appearance. Mustache bristling, Jameson dropped into a chair opposite Osborn. "Early for you as well, Norman. Me, I just walked out of a meeting with my idiot accountants." "Ah, so you came out of an unpleasant meeting. Me, I have to head into one. So I figured some quiet time with a good newspaper and a better brandy," and he held up his brandy, swirling the contents slightly in the glass, "might be just what the doctor ordered to help get through it." "Where is it? Your factory out on the island?" Osborn nodded and leaned back in the chair. There was a look of amusement on his face. "Yes, Jonah, it's my factory out on Long Island. And no, I'm not going to go into details. With an old newsbound like you, less is always better to say than more." Jameson didn't laugh, since Jameson never laughed. The most he ever managed was a sort of gruff bark, which was what he produced now. "Don't overestimate yourself, Norman. The day-to-day workings of Oscorp aren't exactly the kind of banner headlines that leave readers begging for more." "Is what readers are begging for of particular concern to you these days, Jonah?" Jameson growled this time. Osborn was starting to wonder if the man wasn't part wolf. "Readership in general is what concerns me. That's what my meeting was about, if you really want to know." "No, I don't especially." But it was too late. Jonah was off on a rant. "Blasted accountants telling me that the newspaper lost $1 million last year and will lose another $1 million this year and very likely another $1 million next year. You know what I told them?" "That at this rate, you'd have to shut the paper down in about 30 years. Jameson blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" "Because I saw Citizen Kane, Jonah. You lifted the line from a 60-year-old movie." "I did?" Jonah frowned, and then his eyes went wide. "Son of a gun, I did. Damn good movie, too, if you ask me." "I didn't ask you, but yes, it was." Truth to tell, Osborn enjoyed these rare verbal fencing matches that he indulged in with Jameson. But JJJ didn't seem in the mood to appreciate it all that much this particular day. You know what's killing our circulation, Norman? Would you like me to tell you? Could I stop you? Said Osborn hopefully, attempting to get back to his newspaper. Our readership is dying out, that's what, Jonah said, as if Osborn hadn't spoken. Osborn sighed and put the paper flat in his lap. Jonah continued. Older readers who grew up reading newspapers and fully realize and appreciate the depth of a news coverage that only a paper can provide are dying out. And these new kids, they get stuff off television or the web. When they express any interest in learning about the world around them, that is. They aren't going to plunk down 50 cents to read intelligent, in-depth reporting when they can get facile news in small, easy-to-digest, bite-sized bites. Now that's a doomsday attitude to have, Jonah. It's realistic. Jonah sounded uncharacteristically self-pitying, even morbid, as he said, I wonder. When the dinosaurs were sinking into pits, their days of glory at an end. I wonder if they made the same kind of howls of frustration that old-time ink under the fingernails newsmen make as our medium goes straight down the tubes. You're being much too hard on yourself, Jonah. And you're forgetting something. Oh, yeah? Jonah shifted the cigar from one side of his mouth to the other without using his hands. He just rolled it over from left to right, smooth as pudding. And what might that be? All you need is one big story. Just one. Something to fire the attention of New Yorkers. If it's a big enough story, people will seek out information on it anywhere they can get it. You may be right, said Jonah. The question is, what sort of story would be big enough? I don't know, Jonah. I'm just a dumb scientist, not a media genius like you. It's the oldest commandment of showbiz. Give the people what they want. What the people want are short, punchy stories with no depth. Black and white, good guys and bad guys, heroes and villains. So what's the problem with that? Asked Osborn. J. Jonah Jameson laughed contemptuously, settling back into his chair with the air of someone who was very much in his element, both physically and philosophically. And here I thought, Norman, that you were a man after my own heart. Don't you know, there are no heroes. Not anymore. If you want greatness in great men, crack a history book and look at the founding fathers. There were great men, men of conviction, men willing to put themselves on the line. And they put their names to the Declaration of Independence knowing that they were signing their death warrants. But they did it because they believed in something. That's gone now. You know what killed heroism, Norman? No, but I suspect you're going to tell me, Osborn said dryly. This whole internet thing, with people having no respect for copyrights because they're busy stealing entire printed works off downloads or going around ranting and raving at each other, striking from behind names like Fuzzy Dice or The Destroyer or Bob1123 or similar nonsense. Jonah was waving his cigar around, ashes flying all over. One of the attendants, long used to Jameson when he went off on a rant, was busily sweeping the ash into a dustbin. How much impact do you think the Declaration would have had, Norman, if it had been filled with signatures like Death Scream or Hoppy Bunny 27? Not very much, Osborn allowed. But to be fair, Jonah, why should anyone want to be a hero in this day and age fostered by your own media? Whenever someone does something heroic, the newspapers grab a hold of him and dig until they find some dirt, and then splash it all over the front pages. Why should anyone want to make themselves such a target? If you're a hero, you don't think about what might happen if you take a risk. You just do what needs to be done, Jonah retorted. I've tried to live my life as scrupulously as possible, Norman. You can't go around bringing down corruption if your own hands aren't clean. People want to investigate me, let them. I have nothing to hide. But do people follow my example? They do not. No heroes anymore, as I said. Don't blame the messenger for the message. Osborn kept telling himself that he shouldn't be baiting Jonah this way, but he was apprehensive enough about the meeting he had to get to, and the old windbag was starting to grate on him. So what is the message you're getting out there that you shouldn't be blamed for? That nobody's good enough to withstand public scrutiny, no matter how well-meaning their actions may seem? Exactly, Jonah said with an emphatic wave of his cigar, sending more ashes tumbling. A couple danced on the lapels of Osborn's jacket, and he brushed them away. Jonah didn't seem to notice. That's exactly it. Funny, said Osborn, scratching his chin thoughtfully as he rose from his chair. I seem to remember a man who lived about 2,000 years ago, who had a touch of the heroic about him. A lot of people looked up to him. A lot of people didn't. So tell me, Jonah, if a man of that caliber of heroism showed up today, would you be listening and learning from him? Or would you be first in line to crucify him? A number of men had been listening to the exchange, and there was a collective guffaw when Osborn said that. Jameson fired looks around, and the laughter was quickly silenced as they went back to their own newspapers. That's not funny, Norman, Jameson said quietly. No, it's not. He patted Jameson on the shoulder. Jonah, I hope for your sake, you get your hero, and you get your story, and you get your circulation numbers back up. God knows we still need newspapers and heroes, and you need someone to tear down. Or build up, he added quickly. That's up to you, isn't it? And as he walked out of the men's club, Jonah called after him, Mark my words, Osborn. The closest we've come to heroes these days is some schmuck with bad timing who falls into it by accident. Jonah, Osborn called over his shoulder, I think you may have just defined hero for the ages. Chapter 3. The Accident. It was the smallest of the small. It tended to stay away from the others, daunted by the disparity in size. While the others moved in leisurely groups, clumps of mandibles and black-furred abdomens, the smallest, the runt, kept to itself. Food was plentiful, and the larger ones got most of it simply because they were bigger and didn't hesitate to hog it. The smallest of the small got the leftovers. As a result, in addition to its diminutive stature, it had a lean and hungry look about it. So while all the others would sit around, fat and contented, the smallest of the small explored every nook and cranny of their home, endlessly and meticulously studying every centimeter. It did not do so out of any sort of plan or long-term strategy. It did so because it had nothing else to do to pass the time. As a consequence, it was the only one that discovered the break in the seal. It found the break purely by accident as it moved around the edges of the grill work that covered one of the air vents. It wasn't a break that a normal creature its size would have been able to exploit, but this was not a normal creature. The creature pulled experimentally on the edge of the seal, and its strength was sufficient to bend it over so slightly, in the place where one of the screws hadn't been driven in as tightly as it should. The others, fat and content as they were, did not notice what the smallest was up to. They did not detect the slight vibration of the small metal grillwork overhead moving, but the vibration abruptly ceased and their attention immediately wandered. They gave no further thought to its source, or to the smallest of the small, which was no longer there. As he entered the Columbia Genetic Research Institute, Peter Parker didn't know where to look first. The laboratory was cavernous, lined with instrumentation the nature of which he could only guess. He saw some stuff that looked vaguely familiar, even a bit similar to things that Peter had worked with. But the equipment he'd used was on a much smaller scale than what he was looking at now. The domed ceiling was so tall it was hard to believe that the building contained it, and the equipment itself was shined to within an inch of its chromed life. Peter's camera was hanging around his neck, the nice sturdy Konica his aunt and uncle had gotten him for Christmas. Too bad we're not Jewish. I would have gotten you a Konica for Hanukkah, Ben had said cheerfully, prompting a moan from Peter and an annoyed thump on his chest from May. The tour guide, a thin, black-haired Asian woman, was guiding them past a large exhibit on spiders. There are more than 32,000 known species of spider in the world, she intoned, managing to sound both important and deathly bored at the same time. The 33 students on the trip responded to Mr. Sullivan's get-over-here gestures by crowding into a circle around their guide, who didn't even appear to notice that anyone was paying attention. They are in the order Aranae, which is divided into 3 suborders, Mesothelia, Orthognatha, and Lepidognatha. All spiders are carnivorous, ravenous eaters who feed on massive quantities of protein in liquid form, usually the juices of their prey. Peter, however, was getting severely distracted from such riveting topics as spider juices. Instead, he was keeping an eye on Mary Jane, who was joking around with some friends of hers. He was still stinging over the way he had fumbled the ball yet again. He had fallen into a depressing routine, trying to talk to her, perhaps getting out a few words of no consequence before folding faster than a tent without a center pole. It was a pretty crummy way to go through life, particularly when it concerned a girl as important to Peter as MJ was. But that could change. He could change. All he needed to do was make that resolution and decide that he was going to start doing things differently. Yes, that was it. That's all he had to do, and it was going to start with Mary Jane. Arachnids from each of the 3 groups possess varying strengths which help them in their constant search for food, the tour guide informed them. Yes, that was it. MJ was a sort of food to him. Soul food. Food that could provide him emotional nourishment if he could only get himself to try her. Well, he was going to do it, that's all. Just do it, like they said in that stupid commercial. He took a deep breath to steady his pounding heart, then took 2 steps toward her. That was as far as he got before Flash Thompson, with a timing bordering on the supernatural, swept in while Peter was still a good 2 yards away, stepped in behind her, partially obscuring her from view. He put his arm around her, nuzzled her neck. Peter gulped deeply, his Adam's apple bobbing up and down. Well, that was certainly all he needed to see. The guide was going on about the jumping spider, family Salticidae, genus Saltisus, on, and Peter turned away from Mary Jane, from Flash, from that which was so upsetting to him that he couldn't even articulate it. For a fraction of an instant, he thought that he saw Mary Jane looking in his direction, and then pulling away from Flash, looking embarrassed over his overt and clumsy attempts at affection. But no, he was certain that it was a product of his fevered imagination, a wish fulfillment that MJ would realize that a guy like Flash wasn't right for her, no matter what her father might say. Her father. Peter had been watching that time. He'd been daydreaming, staring out his window, when he'd seen Flash Thompson pull up to her house. Flash had walked up to the door, knocked, and MJ's father had opened the door. Seeing the 2 of them together, Peter was struck by the similarities in terms of build and deportment. They'd laughed together there on the stoop, and although Peter couldn't hear what was being said, he had no doubt that it was bursting with enough machismo to grow hair on anything that didn't normally sport hair. When Flash had left with MJ on his arm, he'd received a pat on the back from her dad, and even a few bucks that MJ's dad dug out of his jacket pocket. It was perfectly obvious. MJ's dad felt he had a lot in common with Flash, and had willingly given his daughter over to him. And Mary Jane had gone along with it. That struck him as unutterably sad, although he wasn't entirely certain why. Peter was abruptly jolted from his thoughts by Mr. Sullivan's loud, pinched voice. He was bellowing at the other kids, who had been looking anywhere and everywhere except at the tour guide, and talking about anything and everything except spiders. Sullivan was standing so close to Peter when he shouted that Peter thought he was going to suffer permanent hearing loss. "Excuse me, is anyone paying attention to the genus Saltisus?" That brought everything screeching to a halt. Even the guide looked shaken. Mr. Sullivan nodded slightly in her direction and said, "I apologize, go on." The tour guide started speaking again, but it was rather tentatively, and she wasn't taking her eyes off Mr. Sullivan, as if concerned that there would be another outburst. The genus Saltasus can leap up to 40 times its body length, thanks to a proportionate muscular strength vastly greater than that of a human being. She was about to continue speaking when she noticed that Peter was trying to catch her eye. She raised her eyebrows in response, clearly inviting a question. Peter held up his camera and gestured to it. "Okay to take a few pictures for the school paper?" The tour guide nodded, and Peter, to his chagrin, noticed that the guide looked more irked than anything. Obviously, she hated being interrupted. But Peter didn't have much time to dwell on any faux pas he might have committed, since he was immediately distracted by another snickering and mutterings of geek. These days it seemed like any words out of his mouth, no matter how innocuous, managed to attract snide commentary and disdain from either Flash or one of his cronies. It shouldn't be getting to him. He knew that intellectually. All of Flash's friends put together had the collective IQ of a dust bunny, and their opinions should have carried just as much weight. But it bothered him nevertheless. And worse, it bothered him that it bothered him. He tried to put it out of his mind, concentrating instead on the nice shot that was set up at that moment, of the tour guide standing just in front of one of the spider displays. It was well framed. It would make a good accompanying piece of art for the article. But with remarkable timing, just as Peter pressed the shutter release, someone banged into his arm, jostling the camera and giving Peter a superb photograph of Harry Osborn's elbow. Peter fired a glance over his shoulder and saw one of Flash's pals, a guy who'd picked up the nickname Hoops due to the number of small rings he had adorning his various piercings, backing away and snickering. The tour guide, unaware of the struggle touched off by the mere act of Peter's trying to take her picture, droned on as if anyone cared. The funnel web spider, family Hexathelidae, genus Atrax, one of the deadliest spiders in the world, spins an intricate funnel-shaped web whose strands have a tensile strength proportionately equal to the type of high-tension wire used in bridge building. Hoping to salvage the moment, Peter started to aim his camera, and once again his elbow was shoved. Hoops wasn't even bothering to be coy about it this time. He shoved Peter's arm deliberately, challengingly. Even though he knew that Hoops could probably break him in half, Peter whirled to face him. Seeing the anger twisting Peter's features, and probably welcoming an opportunity to tap dance on Peter's face, Hoops took a step forward in a threatening manner. But then a voice, low and commanding, said, "Leave him alone." Hoops and Peter turned to see the speaker, Harry Osborn. As opposed to both Peter and Hoops, who were wearing their respective outrages openly on their faces, Harry's mien was one of utter calm. Obviously, he wasn't going to give Hoops the satisfaction of seeing him angry, as if Hoops wasn't worthy of the privilege. Nevertheless, Hoops said defiantly, "Or what?" Flash, without batting an eye, replied, "Or his father will fire your father." Hoops blanched at that, and several kids standing around, who had overheard the exchange, laughed loudly. Harry didn't seem perturbed by the attention, although Peter flushed a bit. But Mr. Sullivan had clearly had it. In a loud, clear voice, he called, "The next person who talks is going to fail this course. I kid you not." Peter didn't think that should be much of a threat to Hoops, Flash, or any of their ilk. He was reasonably sure the only time they ever saw a D, C, B, or A coming their way was if they were standing on a subway platform. Nevertheless, Hoops backed off, although he did spare a fairly nasty glare for Harry. Harry, for his part, didn't seem to notice or care. Continuing along the display, the tour guide said, "The crab spider, family Thomisidae, genus Misumena, spins a web to catch its prey, but hunts instead, using a set of reflexes with nerve conduction velocity so fast, some researchers believe it almost borders on precognition, an early awareness of danger, and she dropped her voice and waggled her fingers to make it sound mysterious, spider sense. They reached the center of the rotunda floor, where researchers were working at computers surrounding an electron microscope. Large video screens around the room displayed giant images of what was obviously the microscope's area of scrutiny, spider DNA. Peter found the entire thing incredibly fascinating, and could tell from a quick glance at his classmates that he was the only one. Was there something wrong with him, or with the rest of them? Over 5 painstaking years, Columbia's genetic research facility has fully mapped the genetic codes of each of these spiders. The guide walked with measured strides around the rotunda, speaking with such pride that one would have thought she personally was in charge of designing a map to track every strand of every chromosome. Armed with these DNA blueprints, she continued, we have now begun what was once thought impossible, interspecies genetic transmutation. Flash had drifted just within Peter's earshot, and just outside of Mary Jane's, and he said very softly, I thought they managed that when you were born, Parker. He guffawed to himself and stepped back just before MJ noticed that he'd said anything. Once again, Peter felt a sharp stinging in his face as the blood rushed to it. He didn't know which was worse, Flash making jokes at his expense, or the knowledge that Mary Jane was Flash's and Peter was left with nothing. In this recombination lab, the guide said, gesturing with one hand to take in the entirety of the amazing complex, we use synthesized transfer RNA to encode an entirely new genome, combining genetic information from all 3 spiders into these 15 genetically designed super spiders, the first mankind has ever produced. Just ahead of them was a glass tank. The aforementioned mutated spiders were crawling along the walls. Peter noted with wry amusement that something had finally presented itself which fully captured the students' attention. They were staring with fascination at the disgusting creatures creeping along the glass. They seemed to be congregating in one area. Peter decided that if he could manage to get a shot with all 15 of them in it at once, that would be extraordinarily cool. Mary Jane had already positioned herself near Spider Central. If he could get her in the shot, so much the better. Harry was also drawing near, but Peter held back a bit in order to get the wider angle and make sure that the 15 were in the shot. Disgusting, said Mary Jane. But she didn't sound especially repulsed. Indeed, she almost seemed enthused, as if they were beautiful in their sheer nauseating appearance. Harry, however, misread her tone of voice. Hateful little things, he said, thinking he was agreeing with her. I love it, said MJ. Quickly realizing his error, Harry amended. Really? Me too. It was all Peter could do not to laugh. Certainly the last thing he wanted to do was start enjoying himself at his friend's expense. He didn't exactly have an abundance of friends, but he sure didn't want to alienate the very few he had. Just imagine, said the tour guide, if one day we can isolate the strengths, powers, and immunities in human beings and transfer that DNA code among ourselves. All known disease could be wiped out. Of course, we're nowhere near ready to start experimenting with humans. So for the moment, we're concentrating on these 15 spiders. Any questions? 14, MJ said abruptly. All eyes went to her, and Mr. Sullivan laughed nervously in a why is she doing this manner. I beg your pardon? Called the tour guide. Undaunted by the challenging looks from the others and the clear chagrin from the teacher, MJ said, There's only 14 spiders. No, the guide said firmly. There's 15. And then, a little less firmly, she asked, Aren't there? The smallest of the small didn't have the strongest of memories when it came to events. The things that it did as a result of instinct, hardwired into it by century upon century of evolution. So the smallest, having departed the case that had been its home, had no recollection of ever having resided there. The only home it now knew was the web that it had delicately spun for itself up among the recesses of the ceiling. Nor did it have a clear recollection that, once upon a time, it had been given food by a mysterious benefactor that was the closest to the concept of God that the creature could come to. All it knew now was that food was no longer forthcoming and that it had to forage for itself. The cravings in its belly were growing by the hour, and it hadn't been able to spin its web fast enough to gather sustenance for itself. The gossamer web it had spun was indeed quite a beauty, and the smallest of the small was now waiting in the middle of it. Waiting for the unwary, waiting for its prey, waiting for something it could trap and cocoon and drain dry. Unfortunately, nothing seemed to be cooperating. No flies or insects of any kind were presenting themselves as an entree, and the smallest was beginning to go mad with hunger. And something else was disrupting the poor creature. Thunderous vibrations from the whatever they were, a far distance below, which were no doubt serving to drive any potential meals away from the web. The creature did not know, could not experience such emotions as anger, but as it became more and more famished, the frustration level built and built. The picture and the opportunity could not have presented itself more perfectly. There was Mary Jane, looking into the glass case, checking out her makeup. It was hard for Peter to believe that she saw any need to take such measures. She was perfect. How could she conceivably improve upon herself? But he didn't question it too closely, because he was busy seizing the chance that had been tossed his way. A few quick steps and he was by her side. He said, "Can I take your picture? I need one with a student in it." Mary Jane turned to look at him, and Peter felt as if he was being pulled completely out of the depressing, frustrating world inhabited by Peter, big-brain loser Parker, and into the sphere where dwelt the magnificence that was Mary Jane. It was a happy, glorious place, and he was pleased just to be the most transient of tourists there. In response, she immediately struck a pose, hiding a small smile behind the practiced pout of a model. She flipped her hair back, eyed the camera as she would a lover, and said in a playfully sulky voice, "Don't make me look ugly." "That's impossible," Peter scoffed, gazing at her through the viewfinder. He could have remained that way all day, but he felt that he had to be thoroughly professional. "Right there. Good." He snapped a picture, and the auto wind shot forward. "And one more?" Except that she had vanished from his viewfinder. She had moved out of frame, drifting toward a group of her friends. "Thanks," Peter called after her. He'd gotten her to smile at him, even if only for a photo. This was turning into a memorable day. The spider had lost its mind. It wasn't as if it had a large mind to begin with, but hunger had overwritten its desire for caution. Eat, eat, eat was the imperative hammering through it, and it decided to go on a hunt rather than wait for something unwary to come to it. There was a target just below it. Its spinnerets lowered it gracefully down closer to its prey. Had the spider been thinking properly, it would have gotten nowhere near this monster, this gigantic thing, but the spider was only concerned about making a last-ditch effort to fill its belly. And when it lunged at its prey, it had no clue that it was the last conscious effort it would ever make. "Ow!" Peter yelped. He had just been turning to look at a huge display of electron microscopes when a sharp pain had gotten him in the right hand. Instinctively, he snapped his wrist, and he caught out of the corner of his eye some sort of bug, an insect, a mosquito perhaps? Peter held up the back of his hand and saw 2 tiny red marks flaring up on it. There was a moment of morbid amusement as he wondered if he'd been assaulted by the world's tiniest vampire, and then he saw a brief movement on the floor. He looked down, his eyes narrowing, as he watched what appeared to be a spider flip over onto its back, its legs curling up like something out of a commercial for Raid. A spider? Peter Parker felt a surge of momentary panic as he looked back in the direction of the spider tank. There had seemed to be some confusion as to whether there were 14 or 15 spiders. Could one of them have escaped? And could this be it? If he'd been bitten by some sort of genetically mutated spider, it could make him sick as anything. Thoughts of blood poisoning tumbled through his head, and he moaned softly. Great, just great. Everyone else goes on a nice ordinary class trip, and good old Peter Parker gets bitten by a toxic spider. But even as the possibility occurred to him, he was inclined to dismiss it. How in the world could a spider have escaped from there anyway? It's not as if one of its relatives could smuggle in a teeny tiny hacksaw. The spiders weren't about to start punching their way through the thick glass. No. Despite Peter's tendency to ascribe a worst-case scenario to everything in the world, even he had to admit that the chances were that this was a normal garden-variety spider. Heck, it didn't even look as big as the others had been. The others had been huge, relatively speaking. This one just looked like a dead arachnid. It was kind of puny, really. And the kids, Flash in particular, did tend to refer to him as Puny Parker. So if he had to be bitten by a spider, it was probably appropriate that it was this one. Peter stood there, rubbing his hand, as the array of electron microscope display screens flashed around him, images of DNA strands dancing over him. He didn't consider it to be particularly ironic in any way. That would change. Chapter 4. The Meeting. Norman Osborn could remember clearly the day that the proud Oscorp Industries factory in Comac, Long Island had first opened. He had stopped going home in those final days, as they rushed to make certain everything was ready for the opening day. He ate, slept, and breathed that building, checking every rivet, every switch plate, every window seal. The first time he saw the neon letters of the huge Oscorp logo flicker to life, he felt a swelling of pride. The first time he beheld a black, noxious cloud belching out of the towering smokestacks, he knew that everything for which he'd been striving all these years had finally been attained. So here he was, years later, and if driving a wrecking machine through the place, leveling it, reducing it to nothing but a pile of rubble had been an option, he would have grabbed it in a heartbeat. Explosives would serve just as well. General Slocum and the others have already started the inspection, said his somewhat high-strung assistant, Simpkins. Dr. Balkin and Mr. Fargus are with them. Above the elevator door, the square that read Research and Development lit up. R&D was situated a fifth of a mile underground, which was a compromise as far as Osborn was concerned. For his full comfort level to be reached, he'd much rather have had it situated somewhere near the Earth's core. Industrial theft was his number one concern, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to avoid having enemies swoop in and steal that which he had labored so long to achieve. There was a soft ping as the elevator doors slid open. Osborn stepped out onto a dizzyingly high catwalk, and his hard green eyes, while appearing to be focused straight ahead, took in everything around him with peripheral vision that would have rivaled the capabilities of security cameras. Simpkins gulped audibly, fighting off a momentary flash of vertigo before gripping the rail and moving behind her boss. She had to pick up speed, because Osborn wasn't slowing down. Why wasn't I told about this? Osborn growled. I don't think they wanted you to know, sir, admitted Simpkins. Osborn moved quickly down a narrow flight of steps, taking two at a time. He hoped Simpkins could keep up, but was too focused on his destination to be concerned if she didn't. He practically vaulted down to the polished floor, ignoring the greeting of "Morning, Mr. Osborn" he got from every employee he passed. As if there was anything good about this morning. As if any of them were remotely happy to see him. Every single one of them was a security risk, no matter how many non-disclosure forms they signed. On the other hand, there was nothing to be done when the enemy strolled right into your lair, or, for that matter, rolled right in. That certainly described Mr. Fargus, sitting imperiously in his wheelchair, his eyebrows thick, his head bald, making him evocative of the professor character from that mutant movie. Mr. Balkan, as always standing behind Fargus, was tall and distinguished looking, but no less erasable. There were other people in suits standing nearby. Damn it. How many people was the Pentagon going to dispatch whenever they wanted to look in on Oscorp's activities? It seemed there were more and more each time, and each one, as far as Osborn was concerned, represented a potential security leak. There was General Slocum in the middle of the lab, doing a slow, measured tread around the project that they had all come to see and, very likely, criticize. Slocum was square-jawed, steely-eyed, beetle-browed, and pea-brained. As for the project itself, it was breathtaking. For all the anger he was feeling towards this intrusion, Osborn was still able to take pleasure in his achievements when his vision was combined with the talents of his people. He remembered the time he had gone to the beach at Harry's pleading. Harry had just gotten a boogie board for his 13th birthday and was thanking his father profusely for his thoughtfulness. It seemed silly to Osborn, but the boy really did seem to be trying lately in school, and it seemed the least Osborn could do. Well, off they'd gone to the beach. At first, Osborn had felt self-conscious splashing about in the surf, but he was making the effort for Harry. It wasn't easy. It was contrary to Osborn's business-first nature and his own upbringing. But no one seemed to be paying attention to him, and he started to relax a bit. But then he started watching Harry and other kids with the boards, skimming the tops of waves, controlling the things with remarkable dexterity. And as they did so, Osborn took a mental snapshot of their actions and found himself transporting the concept in his mind. Instead of skimming waves, they were hurtling over battlefields, deftly maneuvering around enemy troops. In his imaginings, they were wearing armor, tight-fitting, lightweight suits, designed for protection, but more than that. They had a cybernetic link to the board. Yes, that was it. They could take it to the next level. It wouldn't be all that much of a jump, really. Rather than depending upon the reflexes of the writer, the board would respond to their very thoughts. When Harry had emerged from the water, his father had been grinning and nodding and clapping his hands with delight. Harry couldn't have been more thrilled at his father's support. Osborn, for his part, was looking right through his son, seeing a vast army of armored boogie-board-riding soldiers. It had taken 4 years, a government contract, and 2 breakthroughs in cybernetics to bring them to the point where they were now. There, in the lab at Oscorp, was the result, mounted atop a servo pole. Since this board was designed for air rather than water, adjustments had been made to make it aerodynamically stable. Fins had been added, and footholds for a more sure grip. And naturally, there was the jet tubing down the middle that would propel the thing. Next to the device, a technician was outfitted in the armored suit, moving his legs and arms while the board obediently responded to every change in his posture. By rights, it should have been eliciting oohs and ahs from the onlookers. Instead, they just stood there and scowled. They were bereft of imagination, nor did they possess the slightest vision, and yet they were coming here and standing in judgment of Osborn's work. He was entering the lab just in time to hear Dr. Mendel Strom, his head of R&D, embark on a detailed explanation of everything that made the glider work. There may not have been a more personally annoying individual on the planet than Strom, with his affectations and slightly mincing manner. But when it came to quantum leaps and cybernetic breakthroughs, the only scientist who had better chops than Strom was probably Dr. Henry Pym, and Pym simply wasn't for sale. Individual personal transports are moving along splendidly, Strom was saying, clearly about to go into detail on the program's progress. I've seen your glider, General Slocum said, pausing momentarily over the word glider with such faint disdain that Osborn wanted to throttle him. That's not why I'm here. Osborn forced pleasantries. General Slocum, he said convivially. Good to see you again. Mr. Balkin, Mr. Fargus, he continued, acknowledging each of them in turn. They didn't respond, just glowered. Always a pleasure to have our board of directors pay us a visit. Slocum didn't seem impressed by Osborn's greetings. I want a progress report on human performance enhancers. Dr. Strom paused a moment, glancing at Osborn, who simply nodded. Gesturing toward a glass-walled isolation chamber on the other side of the lab, Strom started toward it, speaking as he went. We tried vapor inhalation with rodent subjects. They showed an 800% increase in strength. Fargus rolled his chair forward. 800%. That's excellent. That gave Osborn a momentary surprise. He didn't think Fargus was capable of praising anyone or anything. Slocum, however, was naturally looking for the downside. Any side effects? He asked. In one trial, Strom began to reply. Yes, Osborn quickly interrupted. It was an aberration. All the tests since then have been successful. But Slocum continued to pointedly ignore Osborn as he addressed Strom. In the test that went wrong, what happened? What were the side effects? Strom didn't hesitate. It was clear that he was extremely concerned about the situation and was welcoming the opportunity to make that concern known. Violence, aggression, and eventually insanity. A silence fell over the group for a moment, and then Slocum said, What's your recommendation? Before Strom could say anything else that could possibly sink Oscorp lower than the R&D level, Osborn stepped in, physically interposing himself between Strom and Slocum. Meeting the general's gaze, he assured him, With the exception of Dr. Strom, our entire staff has certified the product ready for human testing. And then the human submarine known as Dr. Strom fired his torpedo, striking the good ship Oscorp across the bow. We need to take the whole line back to Formula. Feeling betrayed, Osborn whirled to face Strom. Back to Formula? Mr. Osborn, Slocum said stiffly, this department has missed 7 consecutive delivery dates. After 5.5 years of R&D, the United States government has a right to expect the super soldier you were contracted to deliver. This was madness! The formula was safe. Strom was just being paranoid. Trying to sound reasonable and assured, Osborn said, These are quantum leaps in science, gentlemen. We are unlocking the secrets of human evolution. I never said it would be cheap or fast, only groundbreaking. Slocum drew himself up so that he towered over Osborn and fixed a cold stare upon him. I'll be frank with you. I never supported your program. We have my predecessor to thank for that. There was another word that he spoke with dripping contempt. Predecessor. Osborn sensed that the other shoe was going to drop, and it was Balkin who dropped it. The General has given the go-ahead to Quest Aerospace to build a prototype of their exoskeleton design. They test in 2 weeks. My God, they're that far along? Osborn fought to keep any looks of panic off his face, even as General Slocum, twisting the knife, said, "If your so-called performance enhancers haven't had a successful human trial by that time, I will pull your funding and give it to them." "Norman," Vargas said, very slowly and very dangerously, "we are not going to lose this contract." All eyes were now on Osborn, obviously waiting for him to say or do something. At that point, all he could manage was a nod and a forced smile. Then he glanced back over his shoulder at the armor and glider, and instead of a foreign battlefield with enemy soldiers strewn around, he was picturing sailing it over a ground littered with the bodies of Slocum, Strom, and the entire board of directors. It gave him some momentary comfort. Chapter 5. The Side Effects. May Parker thought she was going to have a heart attack. She had just walked into the living room to discover her brilliant husband standing precariously on a chair, stretching his arm as far as he could to try to change a light bulb in the overhead fixture. Ben was grunting, his full concentration on the job at hand. Pale sunlight was filtering through the just vacuumed Venetian blinds, causing him to squint as the chair tilted ever so slightly on the carpeted floor. For a moment, all May could think about was that he would fall forward, crack his head open, and blood would permanently stain her couch, making her wistful for the plastic coverings that they'd removed years ago to keep Peter happy. Then she decided she really had to reorder her priorities and instead prevent Ben from getting himself killed. "Why aren't you using a ladder? You'll fall and break your neck," she admonished him, indicating the bulb. She continued, "Wait for Peter to do that." Ben ignored her as he was wont to do. Instead, with a final triumphant twist, he got the bulb in and it illuminated. "And the Lord said, 'Let there be light,'" he intoned, "and voila, 75 soft glowing watts of it." He started to step down off the chair, clutching the burnt-out bulb with one hand, and Aunt May stood just behind him to break his fall should it come to that. Not that she'd do him all that much good. If he landed on her, he'd likely kill her. But she felt as if she had to do something. "Good boy," she said sarcastically. "God'll be thrilled. Just don't fall on your ass." The moment his foot was on solid ground, she headed into the kitchen to continue preparing dinner. As she went about doing so, Ben called after her, "I'm already on my ass, May. When the plant senior electrician is laid off after 35 years, what else would you call it? I am on my ass." She'd heard him rant about it so much that she was able to mouth it along with him. Standing at the stove, she checked on water that was about to boil. Ben walked in behind her, tossing the burnt-out bulb into the garbage can. Figuring her husband might as well make himself useful, May said, "Hand me the bowl, the green one." Ben picked up the requested kitchen implement, and then went to the newspaper that was spread out on the table. He flipped to the classified section and shook his head dispiritedly. "Corporations firing people left and right so they can have a few billion more. What do they know about standing on a stool screwing in a light bulb?" Standing around in pitch blackness was beginning to sound preferable to listening to Ben carry on. "Ben, you'll get another job somewhere." "Well, let's see," Ben said with mock joviality, running his finger along the job notices. "Computer analyst, computer designer, computer engineer, computer..." His point made, he let out a melancholy sigh. "I'm 68 years old, May. I have to provide for my family." She hated to see him this way. So dispirited, so frustrated. Ben was of a generation that set a great deal of store by the ability of a husband to keep a roof over his loved ones' heads. The loss of his job had been an unmanning experience for him. Granted, he wasn't a young man anymore, but Ben had a natural ebullience that belied his advanced years. That was missing now, consumed by doubt and self-pity. Turning the flame down under the pot, she stepped in behind him, embraced him, and kissed him on the cheek. "I love you," she assured him. "And Peter loves you. You're the most responsible man I've ever known. You've been down and out before, but somehow we survive." Not wishing to dwell too long on maudlin concerns, she stood up and said, "Where is Peter anyway? He's late." At that moment, the front door opened and then slammed. Ben quickly turned the newspaper to the comic strips and called heartily, "Here he is." "Just in time for dinner," May said. The roast she was making in the oven was already giving off pleasing cooked smells that were filling the kitchen. She dropped some potatoes to be boiled into the water on the stovetop. "How was the field trip?" May's back was to Peter, but when he didn't respond promptly, she turned and glanced at him. She was taken aback by his wan look. It seemed as if he could barely stand up. "I don't feel well. I want to go to sleep," he moaned softly. She immediately wanted to start making a fuss over him, but knew how that would make him feel, and every time she did it, he'd complain she was overreacting. So, keeping a lid on her natural impulses, she instead said with just a touch of disappointment, "Oh, you won't have a bite?" For some reason, he gave her the oddest look when she said that. Then he shrugged and, heading for the stairs, said in what sounded like a bleakly amused tone, "No thanks. Had a bite." "Did you get some good pictures, Peter?" asked Ben. But Peter was already at the stairs, trudging as if he had lead weights attached to his ankles. "Got a crash. Everything's fine." And with that, he vanished. Moments later, they heard the slamming of his bedroom door. Ben, his own concerns forgotten, turned with a mystified air toward May. "What's that all about?" he asked. May was already moving toward the base of the stairs, but trying to sound nonchalant, she said, "He's a teenager." "He's depressed," said Ben. "He's a teenager," she told him again, as if that was all the explanation that could possibly be needed. And perhaps it was. Ben paused, considering her explanation, but then said firmly, "I better go up." May was even more firm. "Stay put," she ordered. "He'll let us know if he needs help." "Help," Peter whispered. He had spoken so softly that his voice didn't carry beyond the confines of his bedroom. It wasn't that he was being macho or trying to tough it out. At that point, he really didn't have the strength to get up any volume. Peter had dropped to his knees in his bedroom, clutching his abdomen in pain. "Help," he gasped again. Writhing in agony, he looked at the spot where the spider had bitten him. It was completely red and swollen. He'd been an idiot. A total idiot. Trying to save Aunt May and Uncle Ben a few bucks on a doctor when he'd obviously been poisoned by that stupid spider. Well, enough was already way too much. He was going to stand up, throw open the door, call down to Aunt May and Uncle Ben that he was sick, and they should haul him immediately to the ER while alerting the toxicology and animal venom unit, presuming there were such things, that they were going to have a major case on their hands. At least, that was what his mind was telling his body he was about to do. His body, however, wasn't the least bit interested in cooperating. Instead, just when he thought it couldn't hurt anymore, it got worse. His legs curled up into a fetal position, and sweat was pouring off his body like a sumo wrestler working a stairmaster. The carpet beneath his head was soaked with perspiration, and he was shaking uncontrollably, extreme heat and lethal chills taking turns pounding through his system. His teeth were chattering, and if he'd been able to make it to a mirror, he would have seen that his eyes were sunken, his face the color of vanilla pudding. He made one final effort to stand, but it would have been impossible to tell by looking at him because he didn't budge from the floor. Instead, he curled up even tighter, his arms clutching around his legs, drawing his knees up to just under his chin. His eyes rolled up into the top of his head, and the final jolt of pain was too overwhelming for him to handle. With a final low moan, he passed out dead away. Under his lids, his eyes continued to flutter. Tortured dreams cascaded through his mind, and he was climbing a strand of DNA, and suddenly the strand was twisting around and back on him, and it broke out into strands of thin gossamer consistency that were like fluttering threads from a spider's web. He struggled to break free of them, and then he saw a spider descending toward him, except Flash's face was reflected in one of its eyes, and Mary Jane's dad in another, and MJ was standing to the side with her friends, posing for pictures and laughing, and as Peter screamed, his voice made no sound at all. And there was a screeching in his head, like something was trying to warn him of incredible danger. And the spider was coming closer and closer, and it seemed to be talking to him. He thought he could hear its voice in his head, but most of what it was saying was incomprehensible. Just 2 words echoed in his head. Great power! Great power! All the things he'd wanted to do, everything he'd ever wanted, popularity and Mary Jane and wiping that smug look off Flash's face, all of it. His for the taking. Except he didn't want it. He just wanted to wake up. Wake up. Wake up! Peter, you'll be late for school. Peter snapped awake, blinking against the sunlight that was pouring in through the window. For one delirious moment, he thought that the sun had come out at night, and then his mind settled down as he realized that, no, the night had passed, and to his very great surprise, he had not woken up dead. Not only that, but the venom had obviously worked its way through his system. He'd probably sweated it out somehow. Peter, came Aunt May's voice a second time, and he heard her tentative footsteps on the stairs. Peter's head snapped around as he saw that he'd more or less trashed his room in the throes of his pain and delirium. Plus, he was still wearing the clothes from the night before. If Aunt May saw him like this, she'd probably panic and become convinced that he was desperately ill, just at the point where he was feeling 100% better. I'm up. I'm getting dressed. The steps paused, and then she said, sounding a bit relieved, All right, better move along. Right, moving. He stretched his legs tentatively. For a moment, he felt some tightness around the calves, and, even more strange, a tingling around his toes. But those quickly disappeared, and movement became unimpaired. He took several deep experimental breaths, and even took his own pulse. Everything seemed fine. And yet, it was a little odd. He felt as if he were a new inhabitant in his own body, learning his way around it like a newborn. He glanced over at the clock and saw that Aunt May had been right. Time was wasting. Then he looked down and saw that his glasses had fallen off and felt mild surprise. With his glasses on, his vision was 20/20, but without them, things were a blur. Yet he'd been able to make out the digital readout on the clock with no problem. He picked up his glasses out of reflex and put them on his face as he stood, and he knocked into a chair. He staggered back, utterly confused as the chair tumbled around. Quickly, he removed his glasses and looked down. Sure enough, there was the chair, big as life, perfectly clear to his vision. But when he tentatively placed his glasses on his face, the chair blurred out as if he were looking through the bottoms of a pair of soda bottles. On, off, on, off. He tested the glasses repeatedly. There was no question about it. Not only could he now see better with his glasses off, he could see perfectly with the glasses off. Weird, he muttered. He had completely soaked through the t-shirt he was wearing. Not even the standard teen tactic of sniffing the armpits was going to salvage this one. He pulled the shirt off over his head and, stripped to the waist, he headed over to his dresser, passing the full-length mirror on the wall. Then he stepped back in front of the mirror, still bare-chested, and gaped. It wasn't his body. It was his head, all right, staring back at him from the mirror. But somehow, for some reason, it was sitting perched atop someone else's torso. It wasn't the frame of a bodybuilder, not hugely overmuscled, but he was definitely ripped. There was serious muscle definition, as if he'd been working out steadily for weeks on end. His stomach was hard and washboard flat, his gut in the muscle cutout commonly referred to as a six-pack. His pectorals weren't Schwarzenegger level, but they were impressive nevertheless. He raised his arm, watched it move up and down in the mirror, matching the gesture. He turned his head slowly left and right, never removing his gaze from his reflection. For a moment, he thought he might still be dreaming. He dug a fingernail into his finger and felt the pinch. Then, just out of curiosity, he tried flexing his pecs as he'd seen some muscle men do. They jumped like a couple of cheerleaders. Peter let out a shriek and jumped back, still never taking his eyes off the reflection of someone who could never, ever, under any circumstances, be addressed as puny Parker. Then there was an insistent knocking at the bedroom door. Peter had been so distracted by the mirror that he hadn't heard Aunt May coming up the stairs. She'd probably been alerted by such little clues as Peter's annoying girl-like scream. "Peter, are you all right?" "Fine," he called back, his voice an octave too high. And he forced himself to lower it. "I'm fine, just fine." "Any better this morning?" she asked tentatively. "Any change?" He flipped his glasses into the garbage can, even as he called back unevenly, feeling shell-shocked. "Change?" "Yep, big change." He grabbed some clothes at random from a drawer, and, as he did so, happened to glance out the window and across the way. He couldn't believe it. His vision was even better than 2020, maybe 2010. And what Peter was seeing now was Mary Jane standing in her bedroom window doing a last-minute check of her hair. He watched, mesmerized. Finally, she tucked her hairbrush into her purse and darted out of view. Suddenly, all the setbacks of the previous day, all the condescension he'd had to endure, came roaring back to him. Something in him cried out for justice, for the ability to put everyone on notice that things were going to be different from now on. There was a minor buzz of warning in the back of his mind that he should still be panicked. He had, after all, undergone some startling metamorphosis. His life had changed overnight. Then again, it had only changed for the better. So what could there really be to be nervous about? Maybe the smart thing to do was just accept this, go with it, and milk it for all it was worth. Peter pulled on a sock, and then discovered there was a huge hole in the heel, so large that it would be visible over the top of his shoe. "Wonderful," he muttered, and yanked the sock off again. It ripped. He stared down at it in confusion. For some bizarre reason, the toe end of the sock had torn clean off and was sticking to the end of his foot. "What is up with that?" he muttered as he pulled the material off his toes and yanked on a new pair of socks. He finished dressing, shoved the edges of his clean t-shirt into the tops of his jeans, and sprinted out the door and down the stairs. He vaulted the banister, landing behind Uncle Ben with the poise and confidence of an Olympic gymnast who had just nailed a complicated dismount. He was desperate to run out the door after Mary Jane, but Aunt May was just emerging from the kitchen with a plate of pancakes and strips of newly made bacon. Peter wanted to stay and savor it. In many ways, it was as if he was truly alive for the first time in his life. Still, he didn't want to let Mary Jane get away. So he compromised, grabbing food off the table and shoveling it down with the efficiency of a black hole. Uncle Ben, sitting at the table, was taken aback and made a point of keeping his fingers away from Peter, lest they be consumed as well. "I gotta go," said Peter between mouthfuls. Ben looked on, hypnotized by the rapid motions of food to mouth. "We thought you were sick." "I was. Got better." Except this time he wasn't waiting for his mouth to be clear of food, so it came out more like, I got better." "Sit down, dear," Aunt May suggested as an entire plate of eggs disappeared into Peter's mouth. "Can't. See you later." Peter slung his books over his shoulder, leaving behind a table of dishes that he'd had an impact on, not unlike the impact a tornado has on a trailer park. "Don't forget, we're painting the kitchen today. Home right after school, right?" called Ben. His voice disappearing into the distance, Peter called, "Sure thing, Uncle Ben. Don't start without me." And then he was gone. May and Ben stared at each other. "What was that about?" asked May. Ben stared down at his own empty plate. "He ate my bacon." Peter had just emerged from his house when he spotted Mary Jane coming out of hers. She was walking as quickly as she could, and her father was leaning against the doorframe. He was speaking with the kind of slur that indicated he'd been drinking. "At this time of the morning?" Peter wondered, astounded. "I don't care what your mother said. It's not okay with me," MJ's father called after her. "You're trash. You'll always be trash, just like her." Peter stopped in his tracks, paralyzed, all of his energy forgotten. How could anyone, much less her own father, say something like that to MJ? MJ, the most perfect, the most wonderful of females? How could someone who should be loving and adoring her and thanking God for blessing him with her, okay, maybe that was a bit over the top, but still, be speaking to her in that manner? "I have to go to school," MJ said quickly, turning on her heel. "Who's stopping you?" her father said with a sneer. From over his shoulder, MJ's mother stepped up and said angrily, "Leave her alone." MJ didn't wait around to see how the confrontation between her parents was going to work out. Instead, she bolted down the sidewalk. Her movement snapped Peter's own paralysis, and he hurried after her. Everything he'd been planning to say to her had gone out the window, because in his imagination, she'd been the smiling, bright, chipper MJ that he knew so well from school. An MJ who was emotionally overwrought, who had to deal with parents, or at least a father, who didn't appreciate her for who and what she was outside of Peter's ability to handle. With all the energy bursting in his sinews, he was sure he could overtake her in a heartbeat, but his own uncertainty slowed him. Talk to her, Peter kept saying to himself as he drew closer to her at a steady but cautious pace. But she was wiping away tears, and Peter's usually nimble mind wasn't able to come up with anything to say, given her emotional stress. There was a loud honking from behind them, and a car packed with her girlfriends pulled up alongside. If Peter thought the transformation he'd undergone from the night before was remarkable, That was nothing compared to the lightning-fast transformation of MJ's face. Immediately, all the despondency and frustration vanished, to be replaced by a broad smile and a party girl demeanor. The car slowed enough for MJ to hop in, and, like Cinderella off to the ball, she was gone. With the girls laughing merrily, the car zipped away, angling around the school bus. School bus? Oh, crap! Peter bolted down the street. Once upon a time, such a hurried, determined sprint would quickly have left him breathless. But not this time. His breathing was slow, steady, and sure, as was his heartbeat. It was as if he wasn't even straining himself, as if the rapid clip at which he was moving was only a fraction of just how quickly he could truly move. Even so, it wasn't quite fast enough as, with a belch of smoke, the bus moved off from the curb. Peter was starting to wonder if the driver was actually waiting until he spotted Peter coming and then gunned the engine and roared away. Peter got to the side of the bus just as it angled away from the curb. There was a "Go Wildcats" banner on the side. Running into the street after the bus, he slammed his hand against the banner with the intention of pounding repeatedly on the bus in order to get it to stop. The bus pulled away. The banner stayed behind. To be specific, the banner was sticking to his fingers, in much the same way the socket clung to his toe, but much more forcefully. He tried to pull the banner clear of one hand, but found it adhering to the other one. Why the hell was the banner so blasted sticky? It was as if it were made of flypaper. Except his eyes told him there was nothing unusual about the material that the banner was made from. It just was clinging to his fingers. No, that wasn't it at all. His fingers were clinging to the banner. And suddenly, something pounded through his head, something with such force that it almost split his skull in two. It was a warning, a sensation, a fight-or-flight response, all clamoring for attention simultaneously. And as he tried to sort it out, a horn blasted above all of it. But the horn was outside his head, not inside, and he whirled just in time to see a truck bearing down on him. He could feel the heat coming off the radiator and could practically smell the rubber of the tires. It was that close. With a scream, Peter leaped out of the way, all the while knowing that there was no way, absolutely no way, that he was going to be able to get out of the way in time, even as the brakes locked and the tires screeched. And then it was gone. The heat, the smell, all gone, to be replaced by a dizzying sensation as if he were flying. He angled up, the breeze of his acceleration hitting him in the face, and below him the ground sped by as if he were a jet lifting off from a runway. That sense of glorious freedom, of not being bound by such trivialities as gravity. And that was when he hit the wall of the building. It wasn't a particularly tall building, a 3-story office structure that housed a law firm, but its bricks were just as solid as any Manhattan skyscraper, and when Peter slammed into it, 40 feet above street level, it almost knocked him unconscious. In his dizzy, confused state, he did something that made absolutely no sense at all. He reached out and tried to hold on to the side of the building so that he wouldn't fall. What made even less sense was that it worked. He clung there, bat-like, his mind trying to process the insanity of what was happening to him. He glanced over his shoulder and saw, 20 yards away, the truck driver standing on the street, staring at his front grille work as if unable to comprehend why there wasn't a teenager smeared all over it. The fellow hesitated a moment, then got down on his hands and knees to inspect the underside. For a moment, Peter thought he was actually dead, and that he would see his body lying there like in those movies with ghosts and angels and such. But then the trucker shrugged, shook his head as if doubting his senses, climbed into the cab and drove off. He left behind him a street that was decidedly devoid of corpses. At that moment, a woman in the office building slid open a window, with the intention of watering some flowers in a window box. Upon seeing Peter, she let out an astounded yelp, enough to startle Peter loose of the wall. The ground yawned up at him, and in his desperation, he grabbed out for a drain pipe to avert the fall and perhaps even pull himself up to the roof in safety. Instead, the urgency of his grip caused him to crush the pipe beneath his steel-hard fingers, and it gave way. Peter fell, his arms waving desperately around, and then he hit the ground on his feet. It made no sense. Falling as he had been, even if he'd landed standing up, his leg bones should have been driven somewhere up into his chest from the impact. Instead, he hit the ground in a crouch, as if he'd fallen only a foot or two. And when he'd stood, it was with no effort, no ache or pain. It was as if dropping off a building and landing unhurt on the ground were the most natural things in the world. The woman overhead had been moving her mouth without benefit of sound emerging from it. And finally, she found her voice and let out a high-pitched scream. Peter ran from the alleyway as fast as his legs would carry him, which it turned out was pretty damned fast. And still, his heart continued beating with that slow, steady calm. It was as if his body had already acclimated to his new situation and was patiently waiting for his mind to catch up. Chapter 6. The First Fight. Human beings are blessed with an infinite capacity to rationalize away or ignore anything their senses cannot comprehend. Peter Parker was no exception, and as a result, he had managed to explain the oddities of the morning by the time lunch rolled around. The banner had been pasted to the side of the bus, and the paste had gotten on his fingers. When the truck had been bearing down on him, he'd managed to jump out of the way, but had hit his head in doing so, stumbling against the side of the building. In his concussed haze, with the events surrounding the spider bite still fresh in his subconscious, he had imagined himself as a giant spider on the side of the building. It all made perfect sense. Certainly far more sense than that he was somehow transforming into a... Well, that was just ridiculous. Utterly ridiculous. Kafka-esque. As Peter Parker awoke one morning from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a giant spider. Yeah, like that was going to happen. Nevertheless, his newly acquired appetite could not be ignored. The cafeteria woman, who was accustomed to Peter being the lightest of eaters, gaped as he loaded up his tray with enough food to feed the marching band. He made his way over to a table, moving with unaccustomed grace as he easily balanced the overladen tray. No one in the cafeteria gave him a second glance as he sat, which was nothing unusual. Peter Parker, after all, wasn't someone who generally registered on most people's radar. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Mary Jane approaching, and for a moment he thought she was going to sit next to him. Instead, she maneuvered toward her customary group of friends who were seated at their table and waving her over. Suddenly, Mary Jane skidded on a wet patch on the floor, the souvenir of a previous lunch period when someone had spilled some milk. In trying not to lose her footing and also to hold on to her tray, MJ accomplished neither, and she started to fall with her tray angling toward the floor. Instantly, Peter was on his feet. It was as if he were moving before the incident unfolded. With his left hand, he snagged her tray, righting it so quickly that nothing spilled from it. At the same time, he dropped his right shoulder so that MJ's flailing hand could clutch onto it. Not having yet realized what had happened, MJ regained her footing, then looked around desperately for the tray, as if hoping she could still catch it. Her eyes widened as she saw Peter holding it effortlessly. She turned and looked at him as if seeing him in a new light. "Wow, great reflexes," she said. Peter himself couldn't really believe that he had pulled it off. He'd been operating purely on instinct, and it was only now, when the moment had passed, that he fully realized what he had done. But he also understood that nonchalance was the key at times like these. So he shrugged as if it were nothing and handed the tray back to her. "Thanks," she said. "No problem." He expected her to simply walk away, but instead, She was staring into his eyes. No, not staring, she was gazing. And he felt as if some sort of electrical connection had been made. "Hey, you have blue eyes," she observed. "I never noticed without your glasses. You just get contacts?" "No, actually, I've got eyesight that would make a hawk jealous, and for all the newfound strength I feel coursing through me, none of it means a thing when compared with the heady sensation of your eyes upon me." "Uh-huh," was all he managed to get out. Then his throat constricted, and while he tried to manage an oral presentation of some of the thoughts tumbling through his head, all of them crowded forward at once, and none of them managed to make it to his mouth. "Well, see ya," Mary Jane said, and shrugging, she turned and walked away. He felt totally devastated. Forgotten once more, angry at his own uncertainty and incompetence, and then, to his astonishment, Mary Jane did something she'd never done before. She glanced over her shoulder at him and smiled. An after-the-fact acknowledgement of him. He couldn't believe it. Despite the fact that she then sat down at the popular kids' table, right next to Flash, of course, he still treasured that brief look she'd sent his way. The look that promised, well, it hadn't promised anything, really, but it had hinted at something he hadn't even dared consider before. Namely, that she found him, what, interesting? Handsome? Peter sat back down at his table and started to eat with the same aggressive bulldozer approach he'd taken at breakfast. He started to set his fork down so that he could pick up the can of soda to his right. The fork stuck to his hand. He stared at it as if it was someone else's hand. Then he tried to pull the fork free with his other hand, only to discover that a long, gooey strand of something was stretching from his hand to the fork. At first, it was like whitish gray mucus, as if he'd blown his nose out through his wrist. But then he pulled on it and pulled, and it reminded him of that stuff he'd had when he was a kid. Silly string. Except the tensile strength was far greater. And somehow it was managing to secrete through his wrist. And what was he doing scientifically analyzing it when the fact was that, holy God, he had some kind of super snot oozing out of his forearms? What the hell was up with that? He pulled even harder on the fork, and rather than separate it from the strand, he instead managed to shoot out another strand, this time from his other hand. And suddenly all the rationalizing, all the reordering in his mind of the morning's events went right out the window as he realized, it's webbing! It's webbing! I've got spinnerets in my forearms. Oh, geez, what if somebody notices? But now it could be worse, At least I'm not shooting webbing out my butt, which is where spiders generally secrete their webbing, and perhaps it might bear some further investigation as to precisely why the spinnerets choose to manifest themselves. And holy God, I'm shooting freaking webs out of my freaking arms! The only thing more horrific to Peter than the webs was the notion of someone spotting them. That would be it for him. Over. Done. No chance of normalcy. No chance of Mary Jane. No chance of nothing. If the other kids saw him oozing white gook out his arms, he might as well just put a paper bag over his head and slink out of high school forever. But things were just going from bad to worse, and the paper bag over his head looked to be a very probable future for him. For the strand he'd just fired shot across the aisle to the table across from him and smacked into Liz Allen's tray. Liz was chatting with someone and hadn't noticed, thank heavens, but he only had seconds in which to act before she did spot it and look to see where and to whom it connected. Hoping to yank the web strand free of the tray, Peter pulled as hard as he could. In retrospect, he should have realized what would happen, but he wasn't thinking especially clearly. Unfortunately, the inevitable did occur. Liz's tray took off like a rocket, arcing through the air straight at Peter. He ducked under the tray as it soared over his head. He heard the tray crash behind him, heard an uproar and shouts, and turned to see what had happened. Flash Thompson was sitting there, wearing the girls' lunch. Jell-O was trickling down his shirt, milk was in his hair, pasta was on his shoulders, and murder was in his eyes. Mary Jane, sitting next to him, wasn't helping the situation by desperately trying to cover up her laughter and failing miserably. MJ's barely stifled laughter was the only noise in the cafeteria at the moment. Like an infuriated rhino trying to find a target, Flash's eyes swept the room, looking for the guilty party. And Peter realized that if there was one thing Thompson the football star was capable of doing, it was chart the trajectory of an incoming object. With rapid-fire calculations he could never have articulated, Flash figured out what direction the tray must have come from. He glanced in Liz's direction, but probably realized that she didn't have the arm strength to hurl the tray that far. So he tracked it to the closest source, and his pig-like stare fell upon a sweating and loudly gulping Peter Parker. "Parker?" Flash said. If he had discovered that Peter Parker was actually Britney Spears in a cunning disguise, he couldn't have reacted with greater incredulity. Instantly, Flash was on his feet, and that same warning of danger was buzzing in Peter's head. Except this time there was no doubt where the jeopardy was coming from. Peter jumped out of his chair, knocking it backward, and he motored out of the cafeteria, dragging the still snagged tray behind him. As the door swung closed after him, the tray didn't make it through in time. It slid up and down the gap between the doors, tapping against them as if pleading to be let out. Finally, the strand broke, and the tray fell to the floor with a crash. In the hallway just outside the cafeteria, Peter paused next to a row of lockers and checked the undersides of his wrists. He didn't have a clue as to exactly what he was going to see. His shirt sleeves were rolled up, and on each of his wrists there was a single, nearly invisible slit. Wonderful. Just wonderful. If anyone ever spotted them, they'd think he'd tried to commit suicide. Then again, considering that Flash Thompson was on his tail, they probably wouldn't blame him. Nevertheless, he quickly rolled down his shirt sleeves as far as they would go in order to cover them. And that was when the warning signals that had been sounding in his head went off again, with even greater strength and clarity than before. This was beyond a simple signal that something was wrong. It was as if he was seeing outside himself, aware of everything around him, all at one time. The very movement of air was an alert to him, and in his mind's eye, he was able to see a fist coming in at him, fast, from behind. Peter whipped around, darting to one side, just in time to avoid Flash Thompson's roundhouse as it slammed into the locker just to the right of his head. Flash hit the locker door with such force that he left an indentation in the metal, then let out a yelp of irritation, shaking the stinging out of his fist, as Peter backpedaled to put some distance between him and the outraged sports star. Mary Jane was coming up behind Flash, and Peter saw Harry coming from another direction. MJ was calling Flash's name, but he wasn't paying the least bit of attention. "You think you're pretty funny, don't you, freak?" Flash demanded, wiping some stray ketchup off his brow. Even under the circumstances, Peter was forced to admit that Flash had good fighting form. His fists were up and cocked, ready to unleash a flurry of punches at Peter the moment he was within range. "Calm down, it was an accident," Mary Jane tried to tell Flash, grabbing at one of his arms. He shook her off, never taking his eyes from his target. "I'm sorry, it really was," Peter said, and the apology was genuine. Despite all the dirt that Flash had done him, he didn't want to sink to Flash's level. Except, why not? Why the hell not? It wasn't as if Flash would ever rise to his level, and he would teach him a lesson by giving him a sound thrashing on the debating team. If Flash was ever going to learn that he should leave Peter alone, descending to Flash's level was the only way the lesson would ever be taught. But could he really do it? Defeating Flash was more than a matter of strength and agility. It was having enough confidence to believe that it was possible. And that was a pool Peter was going to wade into with very tentative steps. Unaware that he was in any physical peril, Flash dismissed Peter's protests by growling, "Yeah, my fist breaking your teeth, that's the accident." Flash's cronies were closing in, but they weren't going to give Flash any help. Why should he need it, after all? It was just puny Parker. They did, however, close a few stray class doors to make sure the teachers within weren't going to see what was about to happen. Peter felt himself moving with strength and certainty. Once again, it was as if his body knew what to do and was just waiting for his brain to catch up. Suddenly, he started to feel genuinely sorry for Flash, as it dawned on him that the bully very likely was going to get more than he bargained for. Endeavoring to give him an out, and yet half hoping Flash wouldn't take it, Peter said, "I don't want to fight you, Flash. I wouldn't want to fight me neither." Well, can't say I didn't try, Peter thought. He balanced carefully on the balls of his feet, his center of gravity low. Flash swung a quick right, then a left. Either of them, had they connected, would have put puny Parker down for the count. Had Flash been dealing with puny Parker, of course. But Peter easily dodged them, making it look effortless, as if he knew where they were going to be coming from and had already arranged to be elsewhere. On some level, one of Flash's cronies realized that this wasn't going according to plan. Perhaps it was the befuddled look on Flash's face when his punches failed to connect. Or perhaps it was the blinding speed with which Peter was moving. Either way, he decided things would go more smoothly if Parker were held immobile. So he lunged from behind, with the intention of wrapping his arms around Peter's torso and keeping him still. Peter, however, wasn't about to let that happen. Just as easily as he'd sensed Flash's attack from behind, he perceived this one as well. He ducked under the grab, leaving Flash's pal overextended and grasping air. Peter then immediately straightened up, catching his assailant off balance and sending him tumbling heels over head to the floor. Flash clearly couldn't believe it. With a roar of outrage, Flash lunged at Peter, swinging an impressive combo of punches. Right jab, right roundhouse, left haymaker. Not a single one connected. Peter wasn't even backing away. He simply twisted this way, that way, pivoted, and then leaned back as if he were a limbo dancer. With each movement, his confidence swelled all the more. It wasn't just that he wasn't getting pummeled. He was actually making Flash look like a fool. In comparison to Peter Parker, Flash Thompson was moving in slow motion. He heard Mary Jane call out to Harry Osborn, "Harry, please help him." "Which one?" asked an obviously impressed Harry. That was it. That was the final validation for Peter, and he was filled with a surge of complete certainty that he had nothing to fear from Flash Thompson ever again. Every prank, every trick, every jibe Thompson had ever tossed at him throughout the years came back to him, like a bottled volcano which had been building up over a decade, then became unstoppered all at once. Flash lunged at Peter once more, and this time Peter didn't try to get out of the way. Instead, he threw a punch that landed solidly on Flash's jaw. He'd always heard that hitting bone upon bone was painful, but he felt nothing aside from giddy and heady satisfaction. There was a pleasing crunch as Flash sailed back, slamming against the far row of lockers with a crash that seemed to echo back through the years of torment, signaling an end to all the harassment and ushering in a new age where nobody stepped on Peter Parker's face anymore, ever again. Flash sunk to the ground with a moan, his eyes closed. "Jesus, Parker," someone exclaimed. "You knocked him out." "Damned straight I did, and it served him right." Peter wanted to shout, but he was still partly in shock, staring at his clenched fist as if it belonged to someone else. Other students were crowding forward, gaping at the unconscious Flash, and someone else said, "Parker did that? Yeah, right." Flash started to sit up, his hands covering the front of his face, and he was groaning. Peter scoffed inwardly, figuring that Flash was playing for sympathy. How pathetic. After all, he hadn't hit him that hard. He couldn't help it if Flash Thompson had a glass jaw and a tendency for melodramatics that would have been more at place in a Spanish soap opera. Then one of his cronies, crouching next to him, pried his hands away from his face, and there was blood everywhere. All over his face, still trickling from his nose, down his chin, onto the front of his shirt. His eyes were already swelling. Within the hour, he'd look like a raccoon. Peter stepped back, horrified, looking at his hands as if an alien had invaded them. The strength in them, the power that he had just displayed, which had made him feel so giddy, so alive, now terrified him. He turned and bolted from the school. Once upon a time, the notion of cutting in the middle of the day would have been unthinkable. Now he gave it no consideration whatsoever. Instead, the only thing on his mind was putting as much distance as possible between himself and the blood-soaked thing that was Flash Thompson. Once in the street, he stopped and looked at the place on his hand where the spider had bitten him. Whereas yesterday it had been red and inflamed, by now it had subsided considerably. Well, why not? The damage had already been done. Peter's life was totally trashed. Chapter 7. The Learning Curve. There was an alleyway near the school, and Peter stopped there, distracted for a moment. A glorious spider web, spun between a dumpster and the alley walls, captured his attention. The sun was glinting off its fresh strands. Peter glanced right and left, and saw that he was alone. Then again, somehow he had already known that. He had a feeling that if someone had been watching him, had posed some sort of danger, he would have, well, sensed it. Spider sense. Once more he looked at the web, and then to his hand. He flexed his fists a couple of times, stretching his fingers, waggling them, and felt a sort of prickling from his fingertips. At first he thought they were becoming numb, but then he slowly brought them closer to the wall, palm upright and flat, and it was as if there were a small surge of static electricity between his digits and the surface of the wall. He placed each hand flat against the wall, very tentatively, then pulled back ever so slightly. The palms moved freely away from the wall, but the fingers remained adhered to it. He slid one of his hands along the wall, and it continued to stick. Then, as if jumping and trying to reach something, he pushed his other arm up and over his head, and that hand stuck as well. He was hanging about half a foot off the ground, his entire weight supported solely by his hands. He started to climb, his feet not actually adhering since they were covered by fairly thick shoe soles, but not needing the additional support or thrust. He just used them for balance and climbed higher and higher, each passing moment bringing more and more confidence. He reminded himself not to get overconfident. He'd become that way with Flash, and a teen with a rearranged face had been the result. He didn't want it to be his turn to have parts of his anatomy rearranged. He achieved the flat rooftop. Rather than hauling his legs up over the edge, he instead vaulted onto the roof, effortlessly swinging the lower half of his body up and over. He dropped into a crouch, then stood upright and bowed slightly, as if to a non-existent audience. There was a series of rooftops, all approximately the same height, stretching out before him, and he studied the array with the same eagerness and sense of unconquerable confidence one usually saw in an accomplished athlete such as a surfer. And that was, in effect, what Peter Parker became, a surfer. Except instead of searching out waves, he was going to surf the rooftops. With total abandon and a sense of fun he previously thought had been denied him, Peter started leaping from one rooftop to the next. Just for amusement, he held his arms outstretched as if he were riding a major wave. And then he wiped out. Not entirely, and not terminally, but damned close. He'd been barreling toward the edge of one roof, preparing to vault to the other side, when he got to one where he realized, at the last moment, that the gap was simply too wide. Or at the very least, it was wide enough that he didn't want to chance it. So he came to an abrupt halt, teetering on the edge. The chasm yawned before him. He could turn around, head back the way he came, or else he could simply climb down the side of the building. Either option was available. Or perhaps there was a third option. He looked down at the slits in his wrist, pushing aside the fact that it still looked as if he had tried to end his life. Although he had to admit the irony, considering where he was and what he was doing. One wrong move, one mistaken judgment, and he'd be putting an end to himself a lot faster than he could by hacking at his wrists. Still, there was no reason he couldn't try to make this webbing goop work for him. So he tried to force the web to spray out by sheer willpower. Nothing. Then he tried wiggling his wrists, but had no more success than before. He saw it as trying to crack a combination lock. It was just a matter of putting together the right assortment of numbers in the correct order. So he opened and closed assorted fingers, combined with twists of the wrist this way and that. At one point he tried, just for laughs, a variation on bunny ears. His palm facing up, he extended all 5 fingers, and then brought his ring and middle fingers toward his palm. Even though he'd been trying to achieve the effect, he was still extremely startled when a loud thwip sounded from the area of his wrist, and a single strand of webbing shot out, straight up. Thankful that he didn't snag a passing pigeon, Peter tried aiming at the building across the way, hoping that the same combination of wrist twist and fingering would produce the same result. His wish was granted, as another strand of webbing zipped out and anchored to the far side of the other building. Peter tugged on it as hard as he could, trying to guess how much strain it would undergo if his full weight was put upon it. It seemed solid. Heck, it was more likely that the bricks would fall out of the wall than that his webbing strand would snap. Now there was a cheerful thought. Nevertheless, he was still understandably apprehensive about what he was going to do. He warned himself not to look down, promptly looked down, and then mentally kicked himself for having done so. Just to play it safe, he wrapped the trailing end of the strand around his hand once, twice. Then, muttering a prayer and fighting an urge to give out a Tarzan yell, he jumped off the roof. He had prepared himself for the possibility of the web breaking free, but it held perfectly. The world whizzed past him, wind in his face, as he held onto the strand and experienced something akin to the exhilarating feeling of flight. This lasted for as long as it took the web line to have its arc terminated by the wall. Peter slammed into it with jaw-rattling force and hung there, flattened, looking like the coyote after an abortive pursuit of the roadrunner. Or perhaps one of those plush toys some people kept suction against their car windows. "Ouch," he muttered. "Ouch," said Madeline Watson, Mary Jane's mother. "One punch, you say?" MJ's father was seated at the kitchen table, knocking back a beer. His night shift at the train yard didn't start for some hours yet, and he was glowering with red eyes at Mary Jane, who was fixing herself a snack from the refrigerator. "I don't believe it," he growled. "She saw it with her own eyes, Phil," Madeline said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "I did. So did everybody else, although a lot of them still don't believe it," MJ said cheerfully. She swung a right cross in the air. "One shot. Bam!" "You sound awfully chipper about it," Philip Watson observed. "Well, I wouldn't say Flash had it coming, but you'd think it without saying it," suggested her mother. This prompted a ready grin from MJ. Philip, however, was not grinning. MJ noticed that he was scowling even more than before. "I'm glad you both think this is funny. The fact is that anyone can get in a lucky punch. Flash was probably taking it easy on him." MJ had been about to bite into her sandwich, but she put it down as she shook her head. "No way, Dad, no way. Peter just took him down, that's all. It wasn't luck. Flash did everything he could and never laid a hand on him." Her father harumphed loudly at this, and then said, "Sounds to me like Flash needs work on his technique. Maybe I'll give him a few pointers when he stops by." Mary Jane's jaw dropped. and she exchanged a look with her mother, who appeared just as surprised. She didn't know which comment to process first. She tried the less inflammatory one. "When is Flash stopping by?" "Oh, he called. Did I forget to tell you?" "Yes!" She managed to turn yes into a 2-syllable word. "Oh. Well, he's coming over to pick you up." And he glanced up at the wall clock, an annoying present from his equally annoying sister, Anna, replete with pictures of birds that gave off bird calls every hour. "Said he wanted to show you his birthday present. Just about any minute he should be here." "Thanks for telling me. And what do you mean you'll give him a few pointers?" Philip looked annoyed that she would question his intentions. "What, you think I can't? In my day, I was all county." "I know what you were, Dad. That's not the point," she said in exasperation, pacing the kitchen. "You want to give Flash some tips on how to pound Peter into the ground? He's your neighbor, for God's sake. How could you?" She dropped into the chair opposite him, her sandwich forgotten, and folded her arms resolutely. "I'm not going out with Flash tonight. I don't feel like it." Bristling, Phil shot back. "I told him you were. Are you trying to make me look like a fool?" "Not everything is about you, Phil," Madeline snapped. "In this house, it sure as hell is." He leaned forward, stabbing a finger into MJ's face. "You better realize this right now, Mary Jane. Flash Thompson is the luckiest break you ever fell into. I've seen that boy play football. He's going to be all-American. He's going to make a ton of money. You could do a lot worse than be married to someone like him." And the words were out of her mouth before she could control them. "Damned right. I could be married to someone like you." Instantly, with a roar, Phil was on his feet, nearly knocking the table over. MJ rolled off the chair, frantically crab-walking backward on the floor as she tried to put some distance between herself and her outraged father. Madeline quickly interposed herself between the two. "Phil, calm down. She didn't mean it." "The hell she didn't!" he bellowed, saving Mary Jane the trouble of saying much the same thing. "She's got a future tied up in a perfect bow, and instead she worries about a loser like Peter Parker." "He's not a loser," Mary Jane cried out defiantly, pulling herself to her feet. "And you would know about that, wouldn't you?" he shot back. He was trembling with rage. "You go out with Flash as I promised him you would, or don't you bother coming back." "Fine," she howled, fighting back tears, and charged out the back door, furiously kicking it shut behind her. Between the constant practicing and the 1 or 2 bouts of unconsciousness, the time had totally slipped away from Peter. It was getting on evening when he finally dashed into the kitchen of his house, calling out for Aunt May and Uncle Ben. He immediately sensed that they weren't around, however. This required no advanced spider-given technique or nearly psychic ability. He'd always been able to tell when they were out. The house seemed sadder when they weren't around, as ludicrous as that sounded. His nose wrinkled as he smelled something odd. He turned and experimentally touched the wall, taking extreme care to do it delicately so that his finger didn't stick to it. It came away with a dab of fresh yellow paint on it. Then he noticed, in the corner of the room, some buckets, a neatly folded drop cloth splattered with paint of a color identical to what was on the wall, and the ladder. He moaned, remembering that he was supposed to have gotten home early so that he and Uncle Ben could paint the kitchen. But when he'd fled from school, he'd become disconnected from everything else he was supposed to be doing. He'd turned totally inward, and now he'd let his uncle down. He felt like a creep. And even worse when he spotted the note on the wall that read, in Aunt May's delicate hand, "Meatloaf and vegetables in the oven, cherry pie on the shelf. We've gone to play bridge at the Andersons." Great. Not only had he broken a promise, but also, instead of leaving an angry note or even being there to chew him out, they left him a dinner. And pie. It was the pie that hurt the most, since Cherry was his favorite. Oh, shoot, he muttered. Then he heard shouting from across the street, from Mary Jane's house. Peter began to wonder if it had always been noisy over at her place, or whether, since a single spider had completely reordered his life, he had just become more attentive, more aware of the world around him. He walked out onto the back steps, giving him a plain view of the back of MJ's house, over the fence that separated the two small yards. He heard words being shouted, words like loser and future, and he was pretty sure, Flash. Figures, he thought sourly, and started to turn to go back inside, when Mary Jane stomped out into her backyard. Even from where he was standing, he could see that she was trembling with fury. She looked up at him, her eyes wet. Suddenly, he felt utterly mortified, like some sort of disgusting, peeping Tom poking in on other people's lives. The thing was, he wasn't accustomed to thinking of MJ as other people, but rather as an angel on earth who should, by rights, have no problems at all. He wanted to dart back into the house, but it was way too late for that. He stood there, paralyzed, and finally managed to accomplish what was, for him, a major achievement: to initiate something approaching a casual conversation with her. "Oh, hi." It wasn't much of a start, but at least it was a start. She wet her lips, brushed away the tears that were obviously brimming in her eyes. She looked mortified, but also defiant, as if daring Peter to feel pity for her. "Were you listening to that?" "No," he said quickly, sounding very guilty, and when he realized how obvious the lie was, he quickly tried to amend it, words tumbling over each other. "Yeah, I heard something, but wasn't listening." "To what?" Mary Jane blinked at the babble, then seemed to take a bit of amusement in his obvious discomfort. "I guess you can always hear us," she said, trying her best to sound casual. "No, I was just taking out the trash." She paused to note the obvious lack of garbage bags in his hand, and raised an amused eyebrow. Well, at least she was capable of finding humor in the situation, no matter how uncomfortable. "You always do your chores, don't you, Peter?" "Well..." When she spoke to him next, she wasn't looking at him. Perhaps she was too embarrassed. "I'm sorry we do that all the time," she said softly. "Your aunt and uncle never scream." "Oh, they can scream pretty good, you know," Peter assured her, and that much was true. Granted, they'd never screamed at him. Their patience with him and for him bordered on the infinite. But he'd heard Uncle Ben scream enough at blind umpires on televised baseball games, and Aunt May screamed back at him that it's just a game, for pity's sake, grow up and let's turn the silly thing off because there's an interesting program on the Discovery Channel about the life cycle of the Luna moth. That kind of thing. He certainly didn't want to rub MJ's nose, however, in the fact that he was better off without parents than she was with parents. "So, where to after you graduate?" she asked, obviously ready to change topics. "A real live conversation. How about that?" Peter strolled forward, suddenly feeling at ease, his hands in his pockets as he approached the fence. "I thought I'd go into the city, get a job as a photographer, work my way through college. What about you?" "Headed for the city, too," she said, matching his steps as she approached the fence as well. "I can't wait to get out of here. I thought I'd..." Then she looked down, embarrassed. "Oh, I don't know." Obviously, she had some sort of career in mind. Figuring he could see her in just about any profession except for the oldest one, Peter said, "Try me." He'd never known Mary Jane Watson to look as vulnerable as she did in that moment, as he realized that she was concerned he would laugh at her. I want to... And she lowered her voice, as if afraid her parents would hear. To act on stage. Be an actress. Hey, that's great. You were really awesome in all the school plays, Mary Jane. Really? She cocked her head eagerly, like a cocker spaniel needing to be petted. Yeah, I cried like a baby when you played Cinderella. Mary Jane blinked in confusion, and then she barely suppressed a smile. Peter, that was in first grade. Well, even so, Peter said, rallying. He was leaning up against the fence now, and she did as well, just to his right. He could smell the perfume wafting from her. He wanted to vault the fence in one jump. He knew he could do it so easily, but he felt, correctly, as if he was dealing with something very delicate, and such an overt move would only shatter the mood. Trying to stay focused on the topic, Peter continued. You know how sometimes you can know something, like what's going to be? Like, tell what's around you, what's coming. He wasn't sure if that had sounded at all coherent, but MJ simply nodded and said, Sometimes. Encouraged, he continued, and you can just see things coming that aren't exactly there, but you just believe. Again she nodded, apparently fancying the thought that Peter had been able to see a first-grade performance of Cinderella and intuit, from that moment on, that she belonged in the theater. What do you see coming for you? She asked. Lately, fists and brick walls. I'm not sure, but it feels like something I never felt before, whatever it is. That much was true enough. However, at that moment, he couldn't have said whether he was referring to his newfound spider abilities or to the fact that he was talking to Mary Jane and she was actually listening to him and even seemed interested in him. And what for me? She asked. You? He laughed, as if the answer was self-evident, a foregone conclusion. You're gonna light up Broadway. She smiled, and then the silence fell between them. There was so much he wanted to say, but as was usually the case at such times, he couldn't even begin to know where to start. MJ was eyeing him, and after a moment she said, You know, you're taller than you look. I hunch, he said. She reached out and put her hands on his biceps. In all the years he'd known her, it was the first time she'd ever touched him. It was as if someone had touched a live wire to him, and he stood bolt upright, a small gasp emerging from between his lips. Good. Don't hunch, she told him. For all his newfound physical prowess, for all the liberating feeling he'd had when vaulting rooftops, never had he felt more energized or alive than he did at that moment. Whereas before, his heartbeat had remained steady no matter what sort of physical exertions he'd been subjecting himself to. Now he could feel it pounding like a trip hammer against his chest. Suddenly, there was a loud, irritating auga from the front driveway, and Peter heard an all-too-familiar voice calling, Hey, MJ, come take a ride in my birthday present. Stay with me, he urged her with such force that he was positive she could hear the words in her head. And indeed, for a moment she did seem torn. There seemed to be more to her indecision than just not knowing with whom she wanted to hang out. When she looked in the direction of Flash's honking, Peter detected, or thought he detected, fear. But fear of what? Fear of being with Flash? Or fear of not being with him? He had no time to inquire or figure it out, though, because suddenly Mary Jane's uncertainty was replaced by her party girl face. The face Peter was slowly starting to realize was a mask she slipped on whenever she wanted to confront the world, without letting it know what was going on in her mind. "Thanks, Pete," she said, patting him on the shoulder. "I gotta go." She dashed around the side of her house, and thankfully Peter couldn't see her as he heard her ooh and ah over what was obviously Flash's new car. Then there was a grinding of gears. Apparently Flash didn't have the hang of it yet, and the car peeled out of the driveway. It roared away, and he caught the briefest glimpse of Mary Jane, laughing, her hair streaming out behind her. Peter watched the car disappear, and then he sagged against the fence like a puppet with its strings severed. He hung there for a time, feeling sorry for himself, and then he reached over and gingerly touched the bicep that she had rested her fingers on. He raised his arm, flexed it, and made a muscle. Made a considerable muscle. And the wheels started turning. Dear Mom and Dad, I've been getting a heck of an education lately, learning about how these new gifts, I guess, I hate saying powers, it sounds so pretentious, work. And also learning about girls, about Mary Jane especially. I'm starting to realize how much she's hurting, and I think that she likes me, or could like me, but she also desperately wants to be happy. And Flash's folks are loaded. He's got money, he can make her happy. I mean, geez, he got a car for his birthday. My last birthday, I got a sweater, not to be confused with the birthday before when I got a sweater. Or the birthday before that when I got a sweater and that weird knit stocking hat that pulls down over my face. Balaclava, I think it's called. I mean, don't get me wrong. Uncle Ben and Aunt May are great. And I remember when he blew a bundle to buy me my camera, and I know it set him back. So there's no way they'll wind up getting me a car. And a photographer doesn't pull in big money either. And if I do get into a career with science, it's not like the starting salaries of research assistants or anything to write home about. And MJ deserves to be happy. She deserves to have a guy who can surround her with fancy stuff. She's had such a crummy home life. It's the least she deserves. I think that's one of the reasons she still hangs with Flash. That and some other reasons I don't really have to go into now. Anyway, I think I've got a plan how to make some serious money. Uncle Ben always says things happen for a reason. Well, when I was cleaning up the kitchen, putting away the drop cloths, and getting ready to toss some of the old newspapers he'd been drying the brushes on, I found an ad. I've got it right here. It says, "Attention amateur wrestlers, $3,000 for just 3 minutes in the ring. Colorful characters a must." Let's face it. I didn't just beat Flash, I clobbered him, and it was no effort at all. None. I wasn't even trying. Sure, I don't have any wrestling experience, but if I was able to do that to Flash when I wasn't trying, imagine what I can do to someone when I am trying. So I've been putting a plan into motion. They want colorful characters? I'll give them one they'll never forget. The first thing I needed was a costume, of course. I've got to have a mask. Anybody sees my teenage face that I shave maybe once a week, they'll be too busy laughing to take me seriously. Besides, I've seen pictures of those Mexican masked wrestler guys, so no one should think anything about it. So I started with costume designs. I must have gone through 100 different kinds, with wings and antenna and extra legs hanging off it, anything you could imagine. I finally came up with a design I liked, with web lines and a spider design on it. And I'll just use that balaclava as a mask. There's so much to do, though, and I'm doing it all alone. I also started practicing with the webbing. It's going to be of absolutely no use to me if I can't find a way to make it go where I want, when I want. Heck, it could wind up hitting me in the face. And I don't think I'm ready to depend so completely on my weird spider sense that I'd want to get into a fight with my eyes closed. So I set up 2 empty glass bottles on a bookcase, went to the opposite side of the room, and tried to hit them with a web strand. Didn't even come close. I tried again and again, thwip and thwump, thwip and thwump. And inside of 5 minutes, I'd managed to cover nearly every object in my room with webbing, except for the freaking bottles. Luckily, it dissolves away to nothing after a while. Aunt May must have heard it, because she came knocking on my door and asked me what was going on. I told her I was exercising and wasn't dressed. Well, don't catch cold, she said to me. She didn't have to worry. With my aim, I couldn't catch an elephant, much less a cold. It was like trying to precisely aim water while using a broken hose. But after a while, I got the hang of it. It just went where I aimed it. I can't tell you how thrilled I was. I started shooting right and left, like a gunslinger taking out bushwhackers. And it wasn't enough to just shoot stuff with the webs. I snagged stuff with pinpoint precision and pulled on it, sending it flying across the room. I was totally into it, not thinking about what I was doing. I don't know, maybe I kind of blanked out or something. All I know is that suddenly Uncle Ben was pounding on the wall, calling to me, "What are you doing in there?" That snapped me out of it, and I looked around my trashed room and said, "Studying hard," which sounded so incredibly lame, but I couldn't think of anything else to say. Mom, Dad, God, I wish you could be here to see this. I mean, I know, if you had lived, if I had been with you, then this whole accident could never have happened. And don't get me wrong, I'd trade all the wall climbing, all the feats of strength, all this incredibly exciting bizarreness that I'm experiencing right now, for 18 years of mundanity with you guys. Like I said before, Uncle Ben claims things happen for a reason. Well, maybe my winding up here and everything I've been through, maybe this was the reason for all of it. I'd be lying if I said I'd figured out all the ramifications and long-term ins and outs of these powers. But as far as the short term goes, I'm on the verge of making some serious breakthroughs. And wherever you're watching from, all those times you've had to sit there in frustration while people walked all over me and called me Puny Parker, well, you don't have to worry about that anymore. Things are changing, starting today, as soon as I get my room cleaned up. You married your sister? Okay, that was a funny line. They were secret heroes, like spies, and they were helping their country, and a bad guy, like the Red Skull, killed them. He held up an old issue of a comic, spine rolled and tattered.
It's funny because that exact thing happened in the comics, and then it turned out they were robots. It was really stupid.
You put the homo in Homo sapiens. Oh boy. Spider-Man, the audiobook, now with added gay jokes, like it's divine right or entitlement or something. Dude, you do not get to talk about entitlement with the way you're writing. This is like prime Redditor stuff. I'm actually getting a little uncomfortable reading this. Sure, this is a journal and not a manifesto. What do you want? What are you yelling at me for? I'm trying to record and I'm months behind. Yeah? You're gonna yell at me? What do you want? What? I just gave them wet food, ladies and gentlemen, and she's yelling at me. Yeah, for wanting. She was completely silent the whole time I was here today, but once I start recording, then she starts yelling at me. Want to come inside here? What do you want? What a tararagundie. Okay, bullshit, Flash knows that song. That's like in... going back to my weirdly obscure knowledge set, that's a 19th century vaudeville song. I'm willing to bet that the person listening to this has no idea what this song is. And get off of Wikipedia. Unless you want to educate yourself, in which case feel free. I'm never against education. But I am against the notion that this Neanderthal knows a song like that. Let alone how to make it into an insult. Oh my god, my poor throat. Oh. Listen to that. Switching between J.K. Simmons and Willem Dafoe is murder. I need water. They're both actors I love, but man, playing both of them one after the other, that's the definition of too much of a good thing. Oh. I need to fan myself with this. It's getting hot in here, too. Okay. A lot of people looked up to him. A lot of people didn't. Hell, my actor played him. Last Temptation. Very good movie. You should go see it. Stars yours truly, Willem Dafoe. Sorry. In addition to its diminutive, fuck this word. Diminutive, all the condescension, fuck this word.